Chapter 625. First of all, I apologize. I didn't update yesterday and I didn't ask for leave at the beginning. There's nothing to explain. It's all my own problem. I've truly drunk too much. I've slept through the early hours of last night and am still not feeling well. Before I came, I had thought that I would definitely get drunk, but I didn't think I would drink so much and fall so thoroughly. I will add yesterday's chapter before the 20th of this month and say my apologies. I'm planning on quitting drinking. Really. Looking at the world with one's eyes drunk and suddenly realizing there's a problem, it's scary. Furthermore, drinking is not good for the body. I have to take responsibility for myself, my family, everyone, and my work. Fan Xian had 2 intelligence teams in his hands. Regarding the movements under the heavens, he investigated quickly. However, the matter of Dongyi opening the sword hut was the most important matter of the various powers' attention. He left the capital quickly. At that time, the Overwatch Council and Baoyue brothel had not returned with intelligence. Yanjing was in the north and had many interactions with the other 2 powers under heaven. Furthermore, the military had its own intelligence network, so he urgently asked Wang Jikuan to see if he had any information. Wang Jikuan furrowed his brows and thought for a moment. He then said without much conviction, logically speaking, it should be Marquis Changning. The influence of Dongyi's direction in the future was too far-reaching. Regardless of whether it was Northern Qi or the Qing Kingdom, they were both very nervous. The Qing Kingdom sending out their best fighter, Fan Xian, would probably not escape the analysis and judgment of the people under heaven. Northern Qi would certainly have to send out a corresponding figure to make Dongyi feel their sincerity and bargaining chips. Marquis Changning was the brother of the Northern Qi Empress Dowager. Furthermore, he was in charge of the Northern Qi Palace Treasury's money flow. He was indeed an important figure. Fan Xian raised his brows and quietly said with some suspicion, "This Marquis is an old acquaintance. He's good at drinking, but when it comes to actually doing things, he's much worse than his son." Wang Jikuan knew they were talking about serious matters. Given his status as a governor, he didn't dare to slight it. Although Wei Hua is the commander of the Brocade Guard, the status of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard is far below that of the council. He doesn't have that much authority. Fan Xian nodded. The Overwatch Council was a special organization. Other than the extremely confident emperor, no emperor dared to allow such an organization to exist. Although the Northern Qi Brocade Guard had inherited the Red Cavalry that Shaoan had organized, under the attacks of the Northern Qi Empress Dowager and the emperor and his mother, their power was far from what it had been in the Wei Kingdom. Particularly after Xin Zhong had been stabbed to death in the street by Shang Shanhu, although the Brocade Guard's power remained, their status was declining day by day. If the Northern Qi Emperor truly wanted to do something in Dongyi, Wei Hua was not a good choice. No matter who they send, in the end, it is a competition of national power. It is best not to think about it anymore. Fan Xian took a sip of wine. A faint tiredness rose between his brows. Wang Jikuan looked at him with a slight smile and said, "Sir Fan Jr.'s trip will certainly be successful." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. Before leaving Jingdou, everyone, including Hu the scholar, had the same confidence as Governor Wang. Even when the emperor was giving instructions in the royal study, it seemed that he had never thought that Fan Xian would lose this battle. He didn't know that in the hearts of the Qing officials and people, the words Sir Fan Jr., embroidered in gold, had long become a patch of gold. Everyone had a great deal of confidence in him. The events of the past 5 years had long proven that as long as he personally acted, there was nothing he could not do. In the spring of the 10th year of the Qing calendar, the entire Qing court seemed to be quietly waiting for Dongyi's submission and Sir Fan Jr.'s carriage to enter the sword hut. Without the use of a single soldier, they would begin to take over a large piece of land, the people living on it, and the vast wealth accumulated over countless years. However, Fan Xian himself would not have such thoughts. Although he had sensed Sigu Jian's attitude through 13th Wang and had carefully expressed his attitude to this sword saint, the 2 sides had, to a certain extent, found a point of intersection of benefits. However, the benefits he had to fight for the Qing Kingdom on this trip to Dongyi were too great. Looking at it from another perspective, the benefits Dongyi had to pay were too great. This was not playing house or a large business that involved millions of liang of silver. It was a true change in history. A true historical event was about to happen in front of Fan Xian's eyes, perhaps even in his hands. In such a situation, Fan Xian had no choice but to be fearful. He often wondered what virtue or ability he had to be able to open up land and expand his borders. Furthermore, he might be walking the path of the Qing dynasty. The problem was Sigu Jian was heavily injured and about to die. His hatred and anger toward the Qing emperor could probably not be washed away even with all the waters of the East Sea. Although this great grandmaster knew that after his death, Dongyi would certainly be divided between the two large countries, he had to think about the city and the vassal states beside it. That was why he had invited Northern Qi and the Qing kingdom to participate in the last opening ceremony of his life. He still had to fight for the people of Dongyi one last time. Fan Xian couldn't help but think of the last deep conversation he had with the emperor in the royal study before he left the capital. At that time, there had been a faint smile on the emperor's face. Although, like the other officials, he was full of confidence in Fan Xian's trip to Dongyi, his words and actions showed that he did not place much importance on this opening ceremony. Fan Xian understood the emperor's thoughts. Someone as confident as the emperor did not care at all about the conciliatory intentions and final goodwill that Dongyi was about to collapse. In the emperor's view, this was Dongyi's last cry of sorrow. If the Qing kingdom could spend less money to obtain Dongyi's land and wealth, it would be worth it. However, if the conditions Sigurjian raised were nonsensical to the Qing emperor would not be afraid to raise the knives and spears in his hands and turn this cry of sorrow into a wretched cry. Given Fan Xian's analysis and understanding of the personalities of these two powerful men, the conditions Sigurjian was about to raise were certainly something the Qing emperor would not be able to accept. This was the biggest problem he faced on this trip. The diplomatic group did not waste too much time in Yanjing. Early the next morning, Fan Xian left the city under the escort of Wang Jikuan and Mei Zhili. He met up with the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council who had hurried over from Jiangnan and headed toward the official road. The group of carriages headed toward the Qing border. Before they had completely left the escorting soldiers of the Yanjing camp, they met up with another group. Under everyone's confused gazes, a merchant climbed into Fan Xian's carriage. "You've worked hard." Fan Xian patted Shi Chanli's shoulder. During these years, 3 of Fan Xian's 4 disciples had worked hard in the Qing court. Only Shi Chanli, who had failed to pass the imperial examinations, had become Fan Xian's personal helper. He had been in Jiangnan and in the luxurious counties outside the borders, opening Baoyue brothel with Sang Wen and secretly helping Fan Xian organize his sources of intelligence. In a low voice, Shi Chanli explained the recent situation of Baoyue brothel to Fan Xian, as well as some small news he had heard in Dongyi. "Looks like 13th Wang was right. There is internal strife in Dongyi. This time, everyone thinks the Qing kingdom is going to pick the fruit. Who would have thought that the fruit could also be poisonous?" Fan Xian listened for a moment and then smiled self-mockingly. "However, I don't know where the master of Dongyi gets his courage to oppose the Qing kingdom when Sigurjian is about to pass away. The northern Qi people are certainly supporting him in secret. Even within the Sword Hut, there are many people who are unwilling to get close to the Qing kingdom. These things are not up to them whether they want to or not." Fan Xian sighed. Power decides everything. Once Sigurjian dies, Northern Qi and Dongyi will no longer have great grandmasters. The two sides can only meet on the battlefield. Northern Qi's territory is vast, the people are rich and the soil is fertile. They have the power to fight the Qing kingdom. However, Dongyi is built on trade. They are rich but not very strong. How can they be a match for the Qing army? The key problem is that Sigurjian was injured by the emperor. Everyone in the Sword Hut hates the Qing kingdom to the bone. They would probably rather fight to the death than submit and become subjects. Shi Chanli had lived the life of a boss these years and had grown fatter. There was no white hair on his head. Compared to his youthful and wretched appearance of the past, he had changed a great deal. The only thing that had not changed was his loyalty and respect for Fan Xian. Since last year he had stayed in Dongyi to investigate the intentions of the Sword Hut. He knew the danger hidden under the deathly silence of the Sword Hut. He couldn't help but worry for his teacher. The key is still Sigurjian's attitude. Fan Xian lowered his head and closed his eyes. Rising and falling with the advance of the carriage, he smiled bitterly and said, "If he is truly an idiot with a twisted temper, there will probably still be a great fight. However, if there really is to be a fight, then what about 13th Wang? If the news you've sent these years is true, then 13th Wang will be his successor. Such a powerful and forceful attitude forces me to think again and again on behalf of Dongyi. Sigurjian can't have made this move for nothing." That's another question. Whether Dongyi leans toward the Qing kingdom or Northern Qi is one thing. However, who will be in charge of the Sword Hut after Sigurjian is another important matter, Shi Chanli said worriedly. Although Sir 13 is deeply favored by Sigurjian, it is Yun Jilan who is the first disciple of the Sword Hut. He has many friends and is very popular. He also has countless disciples and juniors supporting him. Additionally, he has the support of the manor of the master of the city and northern Qi. If Sigu Jian dies, I'm afraid Yun Jilan will not give Sir 13 any chance. Fan Xian opened his eyes. A cold light flashed through them. He muttered to himself, "Are we going to have to kill the entire family like many years ago before the sword hut can decide who it belongs to?" He was talking about an old matter that happened many years ago in Dongyi. Sigu Jian had caused people's hair to stand on end and killed hundreds of people in his family. He didn't even let his own parents go. His infamy as a madman and idiot spread like wildfire. At the same time, it allowed the Overwatch Council to pick up a shadow until today. Shi Chanli was silent. He didn't know how to reply. "The master of Dongyi will certainly not accept our conditions," Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian said quietly, "There is a book about the three kingdoms that says the officials can surrender because they are still officials. Only the master of the city, if he surrenders, then he is nothing. There is another important matter, which is Dongyi's legacy." He rubbed the space between his brows. "If Yun Jilan really wants to fight with 13, outsiders like us won't be able to do much beforehand." Shi Chanli was silent for a moment. He then asked in a small voice, "Teacher, before you left the capital, what was the bottom line the emperor gave? Become subjects, pay tribute, disperse the army, open the borders of each vassal state, allow the Qing army to enter, and allow the nobles to all live in Jingdo," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Shi Chanli sucked in a cold breath. He thought that once these conditions were laid out, it would be the same as crippling Dongyi. The emperor's appetite was too big. He wanted to use the power of the country to carry out intimidation and subdue the enemy without a fight. No one in Dongyi would dare to accept such humiliating conditions. Of course, the length of time can be discussed later. "There is no need to fight for a moment," Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian asked quietly. This was something he had privately argued with the Qing emperor for a long time before he bought more time for Dongyi. He paused and then continued, "If these nobles don't dare to live in Jingdo, the emperor will build them a new manor in Yanjing. Naturally, he will not mistreat them." Shi Chanli suppressed the shock in his heart and shook his head. "No one will agree. Such conditions are the same as putting their heads on the chopping board of the Qing kingdom. I'm afraid they would rather fight to the death. At least there will be some hope." Fan Xian didn't reply to this question. Instead he said, "The northern Qi people will certainly not watch as Dongyi is swallowed by us. This time they will certainly do something." "What can they do?" Fan Xian lifted the curtains and looked at the green trees on the road. Casually he said, "The northern Qi emperor will first try to persuade Sigu Jian to ally with northern Qi before he dies so that northern Qi will give Dongyi a great deal of support. Once the northern Qi people find out that Dongyi cannot hold out and is prepared to agree to the Qing kingdom's treaty, they will stop at nothing to break this agreement." Without waiting for Shi Chanli to speak, he continued in a quiet voice, "Kill me or kill an important figure in Dongyi to incite the already strong hatred and bloodshed between Dongyi and the Qing kingdom. Once the war starts, even if Dongyi wants to surrender, given the emperor's personality, he will not agree. At that time, the northern Qi people will be able to ride on the wall and make other plans." As they spoke, the group of carriages turned in the southeast direction. Leaning against a small mountain, they followed a clear stream and headed in the direction of the Song kingdom. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked back. Yanjing could still be seen clearly. The soldiers in the camp were waiting for the arrival of the war, or perhaps they were terrified of the arrival of the war. The young lady of the Wang family was going to marry into Prince Heching's manor as a secondary fei, so it was impossible for her to see Fan Xian off. However, she still respectfully asked Governor Wang to bring Fan Xian a gift. Every time he thought of this young lady, who was at first unruly and unparalleled but later had been punished by him into a wretched state, Fan Xian's emotions would feel complicated. No matter what kind of person's personality, whether it was a great grandmaster or an arrogant and unruly daughter of a noble family, if he or she had a goal he or she had to achieve in this world, then he or she would certainly be willing to pay a price for it that he or she would normally not pay. "I am only worried about one thing right now." Fan Xian withdrew his gaze from the carriage window and quietly said, "Sigu Jian is not a saint. If he is like me and believes in the creed of not being afraid of the flood after death, then it will be troublesome." It was clear that Shi Chanli did not completely understand these words. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and said, "Before Ku he died, he made 2 ruthless moves and dragged on the Qing kingdom with great difficulty. It also gave me a strange headache. For major figures like them, they see further than anyone else. I find it difficult to believe that Sigu Jian, who had lost to the emperor and struggled at death's door to this day and thought about it for 2.5 years, would willingly admit defeat and not have any other thoughts. He was afraid of these great grandmasters' terrifying thoughts. On the third day, the group of carriages passed through the invisible border hidden in the plains and entered the Song Kingdom. The area of this small vassal state was not large. It was not even the size of a large province in the Qing Kingdom or northern Qi, but it had a long history. Although there was a king in name, in reality, everything was controlled by Dongyi. Other than the power to appoint and remove officials, all of the armed forces came from the manor of the master of Dongyi and the sword hut. Fan Xian was not unfamiliar with the Song Kingdom. He was very familiar with this path. The Baoyue brothel in the Song Kingdom had opened very early. It was the first batch of experiments when Fan Xian controlled the high-end brothel industry and developed a chain store. During the Dong Mountain incident a few years ago, after Fan Xian killed Yan Xiaoyi, he escaped the mountains with a heavily injured body. He had also entered the territory of the Song Kingdom, passed through Yanjing and finally returned to Jingdo. Leading the Overwatch Council, he launched a ruthless counterattack against the eldest princess faction. After the previous year, Fan Xian was alone. He hid his identity and disguised himself. He was tired in body and mind, and his injuries lingered. He didn't know what path to take. When he came this year, he was accompanied by a canopy of officials and attendants like clouds. He was well-dressed and watched by tens of thousands of people. His glory was boundless. With the title of the most powerful official in the world, he walked proudly on the streets of the Song Kingdom. In Fan Xian's view, he had not changed at all. What had truly changed was the comparison of power among the three powers under heaven. Refusing the Song Kingdom's warm reception and avoiding the cautious and complicated gazes, Fan Xian and his group moved into Baoyue brothel. After all, it was his own business, so he was more at ease in terms of safety. Moments after they entered the brothel, a Song Kingdom official came with a nervous expression to report that a guest had arrived and requested to see Sir Fan Jr. Fan Xian's expression froze slightly. Looking at the official's nervous expression, he knew who the guest was. He couldn't help but smile. He thought that it was quite a coincidence that he had just arrived, and the Northern Qi people had also arrived. He rose and walked out of the hall. Raising his hands in a salute, he smiled and said, "Brother Wei Hua, I didn't expect it to be you." Chapter 626. Alright everyone, please continue to kill me. It looks like the wine I drank the day before yesterday has not completely sobered me. The 7th chapter should be about the Son of Heaven. Why is it about having fun in front of the palace again? He was completely speechless to the extreme. He lowered his head and admitted his guilt. The chapter was called Zhou Gong as the teacher. It came from a line in the historical records of Zhou Benji. Zhou Gong as the teacher attacked Huai in the east. It referred to Fan Xian entering Dongyi. It was a spring day. Zhou Gong slept soundly and so did Fan Xian. Of course, I found this part on Baidu. P.S. Today is the last day the monthly votes will be doubled. Given my condition and level of effort these 2 days, I truly do not have the confidence to ask for a vote. However, I will still shout. I will not release a single chapter to ask for votes. I promise everyone that for the rest of this month I will let me, who is writing, and you, who is reading, live happily and of high quality. Amit Ba, those who believe in me, please bestow a monthly vote. Fan Xian and Wei Hua, the two heads of the greatest special agents in the world, were like two pure and open-minded scholars holding hands and exchanging pleasantries. They were filled with admiration and speechlessness. Immediately they sat down hand in hand and drank and chatted merrily. They thought back to the foreign affairs of Shangjing in the past and quietly talked about smuggling. When they were happy they laughed loudly. When they were emotional they had 1,000 thoughts. Such a sincere display stunned the accompanying officials of the Song Kingdom, as well as the officials of the Board of Rites from Northern Qi and the Qing Kingdom, and their attendants. They wondered if the two of them had such a good relationship. Immediately, everyone understood the reason and sighed with admiration. They thought to themselves that, in the end, he was the head of the top special agents. With such a shameless and hypocritical nature, it was indeed a meeting of talent. They appreciated each other and couldn't help themselves. After sitting and chatting for a while, everyone knew that since the two of them had met in the Song Kingdom, they would represent the large power behind them and carry out a test. They would use words to force out some knives and swords. If they were to stand to the side, they would only see the two of them laughing. Very consciously they retreated. After the serving girls finished serving, they also retreated. The most luxurious single room in Baoyue brothel immediately sank into silence. Fan Xian did not sit at the table. Instead, he sat down on a carved wooden chair to the side. His gaze was very calm. Looking at Wei Hua, he said, "You arrived yesterday and came to my door today. You really aren't going to give me a chance to breathe. Wei Hua smiled and picked up a hot towel from the table to wipe his face. He walked to Fan Xian's side and sat down. After thinking for a moment, he quietly said, "Although everyone can guess that Sir Fan Jr. will come personally, if they don't see it with their own eyes, how can the millions of people of the Qi Kingdom be at ease?" Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. He smiled and said, "What? Are you here to seek justice for the people of Daqi?" Last year, the Overwatch Council had launched an attack in Xiliang and caught all of the Northern Qi spies and secret agents who had infiltrated Dingqing and Qingzhou and colluded with the Hu people. They had killed countless people. This matter caused the Northern Qi court to become furious after a great shock. The superficial peace that the Northern Qi Emperor and Fan Xian had done their best to maintain finally tore a large hole in it. There was no one else in the hall. Fan Xian and Wei Hua would not continue to chat about the weather. Their voices became light and icy. Wei Hua glanced at him and said in a cold voice, "Sir Fan Jr., when you and I worked together in the past, it could be said that we trusted each other. Last year you did something like this without any warning. Didn't you go too far?" Fan Xian's brows rose. A ruthlessness flashed in his eyes. "You colluded with the Hu people and killed the people of the Qing Kingdom. Did I have to tell you before I did something? Who do you think you are?" Wei Hua's heart trembled slightly. Only now did he know that Fan Xian was no longer the gentle and amiable young man who had just come out into the world in Shangjing. He was silent for a moment and then said, "Don't bring up old matters. However, I don't know what exactly Sir Fan Jr. is thinking about going to Dongyi to attend the opening ceremony." "Are you stupid?" Fan Xian said with slight mockery. "I am the Duke of Dambua of the Qing Kingdom. What I am going to Dongyi this time is for the benefit of the Qing Kingdom. It's not like you don't know, so why ask?" Wei Hua furrowed his brows and felt a chill in his heart. He thought that although the emperor was talented and managed the court affairs in an orderly manner, the situation in the world was here. The Qing Kingdom was as powerful as it was yesterday. If he wanted to persuade the Sword Hut and the master of the city to not be overwhelmed by the Qing Kingdom's power, it would be a difficult task. Particularly since the Qing Kingdom had sent Fan Xian, a person he had never seen clearly, his heart was beating like a drum. He did not have much confidence. "Someone asked me to ask you something," Wei Hua said as he sat by Fan Xian's side. Wei Hua sat beside Fan Xian. Lowering his voice, he said, "Does the agreement in the restaurant still stand?" After these words were said, Fan Xian's expression changed slightly. A difficult-to-grasp self-mockery shone through his eyes. Quietly he said, "What agreement?" Wei Hua's expression did not change. However, his brows furrowed a little deeper. Perhaps even he did not know what the emperor wanted him to ask about the agreement. His throat was a little dry as he asked, "Are you prepared to break your promise?" Hearing these words, Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Standing, he said, "First, there has never been any agreement. Second, should you be the one to tell me about such things?" Although Wei Hua was the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard and had the Northern Qi Emperor's trust, his status in the country was far below Fan Xian's. Fan Xian was certain that the other party did not have the right to negotiate with him. "Dongyi is a large piece of venison." Fan Xian turned to look at him and said, "Those who are capable will have it. I will not give it to them." Wei Hua rose and replied calmly, "The Qi Kingdom will not give it to them either." The atmosphere in the hall gradually froze. Slowly releasing the will of knives and swords, the coldness immediately rose. It froze the precious and steaming dishes on the table until they didn't dare to breathe. Fan Xian only laughed and sat down at the table. With a fork in one hand and a dish in the other, he casually said, "Since Sigu Jian invited you, Northern Qi is not the only one who came. I am very curious as to who your true leader is." Naturally, Wei Hua would not answer this question. The coldness in his heart grew stronger and stronger. Looking at the young and handsome official of the Qing court in front of him, he felt a great fear. Everyone in the world knew that Fan Xian controlled the Overwatch Council with one hand and the palace treasury with the other. He was the Qing Emperor's right-hand man. If he wanted to weaken the Qing Kingdom's power, being able to kill him would be a wonderful choice. However, Wei Hua could not make this decision. He did not have the right to make this decision. After the two recent events, the Northern Qi court had all become aware of Fan Xian's power. For such a person it was good to be able to kill him. However, if he was not killed, there would be endless trouble in the future. In this world, who could kill Fan Xian? In the past, the eldest princess could not do it. The assassins the Qin family had set up in the valley also could not do it. Was it only the Northern Qi brocade guards or the ninth-level assassins of the Dongi sword hut along the way? Wei Hua gathered his thoughts and sat down again. He did his best to stabilize his emotions. He accompanied Fan Xian, who had already recovered his calm, as he ate and chatted idly. The Qin Kingdom and Northern Qi were the two most powerful powers in the world. The two large diplomatic groups heading to Dongi to witness the opening ceremony of the hut had coincidentally run into each other the moment they entered the territory controlled by Dongi. This reality made many people feel fear and unease. In particular, the welcoming disciples of the Dongi sword hut and the officials of the manor of the master of the city were very cautious. They were terrified that the two sides would become envious and impatient and start fighting. The diplomatic groups on both sides added up to 500 people. Coincidentally, they lived in two adjacent courtyards. Every time they entered or left, the officials of both sides stood on either side of the long street. Under the hostile confrontation, it was truly a terrifying sight. 1,000 eyes used their gazes to kill. No one in such an environment would have it easy. Wei Hua was deeply worried, but he appeared relatively calm. The truly calm person was Fan Xian. He was not worried at all that they would run into any danger on this trip. Unless Sigu Jian had already made a crazy decision, no one in Dongi would risk the Qing Emperor's rage and attack the Qing Kingdom's diplomatic group. The officials and nobles of the Song Kingdom did not dare offend either side. They all used the highest level of etiquette and extravagance to express their sincerity. They were especially humble toward Fan Xian, the Duke of Dongbua of the Qin Kingdom. Fortunately, the first close contact between the diplomatic groups in Dongi only lasted for a day. Wei Hua did not obtain any comforting information from Fan Xian. The unease in his heart grew heavier and heavier. He did not have the energy to continue testing the conditions the Qin Kingdom was going to give Dongi. He left the Song Kingdom early. The officials of the Song Kingdom and the people from Dongi who had come to receive them watched this scene and all let out a breath. However, on the afternoon that the Northern Qi diplomatic group left, Fan Xian gave an order, and the Qin diplomatic group followed. They followed for 3 days. Fan Xian only felt sleepy on the carriage. It seemed that he was not worried about anything happening in Dongi. However, the officials of the Qin Ministry of Rites knew that the Northern Qi diplomatic group was in front, so they suppressed their own group's speed and did not come into contact with them again. After Fan Xian slept lazily for a few days, he finally found a problem with the group's speed. He furrowed his brows and asked, "According to the original schedule, we should have reached Dragon Mountain by now. Why are we only entering Huaishang now?" Shi Chanli also felt it was strange. He asked a member of the Qinian unit of the Overwatch Council in front of him and finally understood the reason. He returned to the carriage and reported, "The Northern Qi diplomatic group is too slow. I don't know if Sir Wei does not want to go to Dongi to receive his failure, so he purposely moved slowly." These words were said with a smile, but Fan Xian did not smile. Shi Chanli closed his mouth. He wondered if there was a problem with the slow speed. Fan Xian scratched his head and furrowed his brows. If someone from Northern Qi left Shangjing, how many days would it take for the information to reach my carriage? At least 8 days. In other words, if someone left Northern Qi's Shangjing 5 days ago and I had no way of knowing. Fan Xian shook his head. If it really was that woman, the news would have been well hidden. If she really came to Dongi, I'm afraid she would have entered the sword hut within these 2 days. He furrowed his brows and said, "And we are still on the road." Shi Chanli's heart trembled slightly. He quietly said, "Even if Lady Haitang went to Dongi early, it would not affect anything." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that Wei Hua had used such a shameful method to give Northern Qi's lobbyist time to meet with Sigu Jian alone. It was truly interesting. However, what was interesting to Northern Qi was rather boring to Fan Xian. So, when the diplomatic group's majestic carriages entered Dragon Mountain, he summoned the officials of the diplomatic group and the subordinates of the Overwatch Council and made a decision that left his subordinates dumbfounded. No one dared to oppose Fan Xian's decision. Another spring had arrived. Willow catkins filled the sky and floated down for thousands of li, like snowflakes swaying in the warm wind. They soared up, covering the city walls and the light of the sea. It made pedestrians cover their faces and scurry away in collective grief. There was no sense of enjoyment at all. 2 traveling merchants wearing bamboo hats stood in the sky full of flying catkins. It was clear that these were 2 strangers from outside the city. They did not dislike these annoying catkins at all. On the contrary, they seemed to be intoxicated by them, standing by the carriage and admiring them endlessly. It truly is the most beautiful scenery in the world. It's a pity that it has covered up the most magnificent city in the world. I can't see it clearly. Shoo. The younger man sneezed loudly, immediately ruining his interest in admiring the spring. The older man next to him did not react. He only stared blankly at the catkins in the air. A moment later, he came to his senses and lightly said, "With such a large city, of course I can see it clearly when I'm closer. I often saw these catkins when I was a child and they all disappeared in 2 days. Young master, your luck is not bad. But speaking of the most beautiful scenery in the world, you have been sleeping these past few days as the carriage has passed through the spring road. I can't tell you are a person who enjoys the scenery." The young man in the bamboo hat raised the brim of his hat and narrowed his eyes at the passing pedestrians and merchants, as well as the city in the distance that could not be seen clearly. He revealed his ordinary and proper face, and a glimmer of a smile flashed through his eyes. This person was none other than Fan Xian of the Qing kingdom. For some reason, he had braved the risk of leaving the diplomatic group and only brought the man next to him to Dongyi. Although Dongyi probably would not act against Fan Xian right now, who knew what kind of arrangements Northern Qi had made here? Fan Xian should not have taken such a risk. However, he had a complicated premonition that he had to come early. Otherwise, Sigurjian might fall to the north. In terms of safety, he was not too worried. Although Dongyi was filled with 9th-level aces, he was already a top 9th-level ace. Additionally, he had the best assassin in the world at his side. If he could not win, it should not be difficult for him to escape. With the shadow at his side, it was as if he had half of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian turned his head to glance at the shadow and couldn't help but smile slightly. On this trip to Dongyi, he had the shadow reveal himself and follow him by his side. Presumably, his enemies who knew him incomparably well would not be able to guess. Having left home at a young age, Fan Xian knew why the shadow was showing such a different emotion than usual, and why he had suddenly become so talkative. Before Uncle Wu Zhu left, he had become more and more talkative. As his #1 admirer, the shadow was also becoming more and more talkative. In Fan Xian's eyes, this was a good thing. "Have you never come back after all these years?" Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and asked in surprise. The shadow pushed down the brim of his straw hat, blocking out the falling cotton and covering his face. Coldly he said, "I can't kill him. Why would I come back?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything more. The massacre in Dongyi back then was too strange. Other than using Sigurjian as a crazy idiot to explain it, there was no other explanation. However, Sigurjian was a great grandmaster. No one dared to ask him anything. Even if Fan Xian wanted to help the shadow resolve the tragic past that had affected his life, he couldn't find any clues. "Your idiot brother is about to die." Fan Xian patted the shadow's shoulder and sighed. "A person's death is like a lamp going out. In the future, when the family is reunited on the road to the underworld, we can go ask." The shadow's shoulders froze. "He must die by my hand." Fan Xian's heart tightened. He didn't know whether he had done the right thing or wrong thing to bring the shadow back to Dongyi. Although the shadow had not returned to Dongyi for a long time, he had, after all, grown up in this large city before he was a youth. He still remembered the directions of the streets clearly. The description of the willow catkins was not wrong. By the time the two of them came close to Dongyi, the flying cotton in the sky had already sunk into the earth and no trace of it could be found. Fan Xian jumped down from the shaft of the carriage and looked at the bustling marketplace and hurrying merchants around him. He sighed emotionally. It is indeed a shopping center. However, after going to the flying cotton, it doesn't have the feeling of a grand city. It is truly disappointing. He was indeed disappointed. Rumor had it that Dongyi was the largest city in the world. Unexpectedly, when Fan Xian actually saw the city, he found that this so-called largest city had no city walls. It was just countless marketplace buildings pieced together. Dongyi was built very late, the shadow said in a cold voice to the side. From the beginning they never built city walls. Fan Xian looked at the gray buildings that filled his field of vision and the layers of streets. He was secretly shocked. The area of Dongyi was truly frighteningly large. After listening to the shadow's explanation, he furrowed his brows and said, "For such a large city to not have city walls, wouldn't that make it easier for enemies to invade?" In the beginning, Dongyi was filled with profit-hungry merchants and foolish common people. It had no ability to resist foreign enemies. Even if they spent countless resources to build a natural stronghold city wall, it would still be impossible for them to resist the armies of Northern Qi or the Qing kingdom. Whether or not there was a city wall did not have much of an effect on Dongyi. The shadow paused for a moment and then said, "Some people say that Big Brother is Dongyi's city wall. If he is alive and Dongyi has no city wall, no enemies will dare to invade. If he is dead, even if Dongi has a 1,000-foot wall, it will still be the end of the country and its family. Chapter 627. Fan Xian and the shadow silently looked at the scenery inside the large city. Perhaps the shadow was deeply moved, but Fan Xian was slightly shaken by the scene before him. Perhaps the shadow was deeply moved, but Fan Xian was slightly shaken by the scenes reflected in his eyes. Dongi indeed lived up to its name as the largest city in the world. It took up a lot of land. Their carriage traveled through the city for a long time, but they were still far from their predetermined destination. Along the way they saw all kinds of buildings and bustling crowds moving through them. Goods from all over the world gathered here. Countless accents rang out on the streets. Countless people wearing different clothing were haggling over prices, and they were using a sign language that Fan Xian was not familiar with. The 100 forms of the marketplace could be seen clearly in this Dongi city that was built on commerce. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and looked down the street. He found that there was not a single item that could not be found in this city. He couldn't help but secretly exclaim in admiration. In such a bustling and prosperous place, who would be able to hold back from spending money on tourists from other places? Although the Qing kingdom had begun to set up a large commercial port in Quanzhou over 20 years ago and relied on the enormous production of the palace treasury to forcefully take a large share of the sea trade with foreigners, it not only directly caused Danzhou port to fall into decline and calm, but it also dealt a great blow to Dongi. However, Dongi was, after all, a place where merchants from all over the world gathered. In particular, the ships that went out to sea were skilled in the art of controlling the waves. They intersected with the land far away, so the trade had continued to flourish. Even with the palace treasury that Fan Xian now controlled, if they wanted to travel by sea, they could not completely rely on Quanzhou to go out to sea. Many adventurers and merchants from overseas were still used to doing business through Dongi. This kind of change would probably take decades. After Fan Xian saw a dozen foreigners on the street, he accepted this point of view in his heart. When he was overseeing Jiangnan, the furthest the foreigners were willing to go was as far as Quanzhou, so he had never seen a single one. Do you find it strange? The shadow asked in a low voice beside him. Foreigners only trust Dongi, so every time the Qing people see these blue-eyed people, they always feel uncomfortable. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that in his previous life, he had once taught mahjong in the foreign students' building all night. How could he feel strange when he saw foreigners? Why don't the foreigners trust the Qing kingdom? At most they are willing to stop at Quanzhou for a few days, they are never willing to go deep into the interior. Fan Xian asked quietly, Northern Qi does not have a suitable outlet to the sea. That is one thing, but we have already built 3 large ports in the Jiangnan area. In particular, the Quanzhou port has been built for over 20 years. Why have we never completely taken away Dongi's position? I'm not too sure either. The shadow pressed down the bamboo hat and coldly said, but I heard that 20 years ago, the Quanzhou Navy had a good relationship with the foreigners. Later, something happened to the Quanzhou Navy, and many of the foreigners were scared away. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and didn't ask any more questions. On his way into the city, he had been looking in all directions and listening in all directions. He had carefully savored the atmosphere of the marketplace that was particularly different from that of this land. He had gradually come to understand the reason for this. Dongi had always been able to occupy the center of the world's commerce because the people there valued freedom. Merchants used their words and actions for profit. On the streets, other than the officials from the manor of the master of the city who maintained public order, there were not many officials. Although he hadn't had the opportunity to personally see the specific process of trade, Fan Xian already had a strong feeling that Dongi's trade basically already had some kind of contract. Regardless of whether it was the manor of the master of the city or the sword hut, neither of them would try to control the actions of the merchants. They would only draw up general market regulations. In comparison, although the Jiangnan area of the Qing kingdom was also developed in commerce, this kind of development and prosperity was, to a large extent, based on the overly special product of the palace treasury. Jiangnan's commerce relied on the unique production of the palace treasury, so it could be completely set by the court, or rather by itself, with very little fluctuation. The commerce of the Qing kingdom's Jiangnan was a kind of commerce that was monopolized by the court. Regardless of whether it was the incomparably illustrious Ming family, the Lingnan Xiong family, or the Quanzhou Sun family, they were only the recipients of the palace treasury. If the court wanted these 3 families to die, then they had no choice but to die. The court did not care about the sanctity of contracts with merchants. However, Dongi's business was rooted in the foundation of equal trade. No power could be like the Qing court and shamelessly use force. No one could be like Fan Xian, who could use the power in his hands to make the Ming family vomit 3,000 liters of blood and innumerable losses. It was clear that, for merchants, the latter kind of prosperity was more reliable, long-lasting, and worthy of trust. Dongyi was like a gathering place and autonomous territory for the world's merchants. They used their sweat or cunning to seek benefits. Their life and death were up to heaven and not imperial power. Fan Xian pulled his gaze back from the door of a large merchant house. An absurd feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. If Dongyi truly leaned toward the Qing kingdom, given the emperor's powerful desire for power, how could he be willing to remain unchanged for 50 years? How could he be willing to have so many merchants not listen to his orders in the territory he ruled? If the glory of the Qing kingdom's powerful imperial power truly descended upon Dongyi, would this prosperous and free or secretly dirty city still be able to maintain its current vitality? Fan Xian and the Shadow chose an unremarkable inn to stay in. After settling down the carriage, they walked onto the main street and merged into the crowd. It was still early, so it was not yet convenient to do what they wanted to do. Thus, these two powerful warriors, each with their own thoughts, decided to imitate the situation of women and once again wandered the streets in the noisy seaside city. The reason Dongyi was so large, other than the shocking amount of trade that attracted merchants from all over the world, was because all kinds of strange people gathered here, such as the great bandit Wang Qinian, and even earlier the young lady of the Yi family and her blind, young servant at her side. With strange people there were naturally legends and legends. Adding to the glorious and threatening name of Sigujien, who knew how many vagrants and homeless people had come to settle down and seek a living. Countless young people from northern Qi and the Qing kingdom had come to travel. Even the Hu people far away on the grasslands and the snowman people in the north had once traveled tens of thousands of li year after year. The population of Dongyi increased, and the city grew larger and larger. Looking at the various styles of buildings on the main street, Fan Xian clicked his tongue in wonder. He thought to himself that the Bund of the past was nothing more than this. However, the Bund had mostly been Western buildings, while the buildings in Dongyi were of various styles from the mainland. Northern Qi inherited the black and green flying eaves from the Wei kingdom, the Qing kingdom's solemn and square buildings, the domed houses on the grasslands and Nanzhao's gilded rain and arrow towers. It was said that back in the day the Western people's buildings had been in the limelight in Dongyi. Later, following the rise of the Yi family, the Western people's position fell completely. The trade on this land began to move in the direction of imports. The reason was simple. They could not make the silk, tea and porcelain that the Western people wanted to buy. The Yi family could also make the expensive glass and mirrors that they used to sell. Furthermore, they made them better and sold them cheaper. Thus, it was very difficult for the kingdoms in the overseas continents to trade on the sea because Dongyi no longer needed their goods. Instead, they were required to use silver to settle accounts. If it weren't for the large amounts of silver mines that were rumored to have been discovered somewhere in the wild lands a dozen years ago, their national coffers would have long been emptied by the cunning and ruthless merchants of Dongyi, as well as the Yi family that had fallen from the sky. They would no longer be able to support the extravagant needs of the nobles in their country. After listening to Fan Xian's rueful words, the Shadow coldly said, "The Western people are no different from us. However, their martial arts are like their sorcerers. They look good but they are actually completely useless. Thus, they can only allow us to exploit them. They only come to complain every year." Hearing these words, Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. He still remembered the first moment he was reborn into this world. He saw the Shadow beside him fly over like an eagle and instantly kill a sorcerer. The sun was slightly setting, but Dongyi was still as lively as before. Although the shops gradually showed signs of closing, the places of pleasure in the middle of the streets were preparing to light up their red lights. "Have you finished looking?" the Shadow suddenly asked. Fan Xian used his fingers to gently pull on his straw hat. After a moment of silence he said, "Yes." He was a traveler from another world, but in this world he could not be a simple traveler. After the rare half-day tour of Dongyi temporarily came to an end, Fan Xian was going to return to the darkness, leaving behind the joy and gratification of sightseeing and picking up his black dagger again. The Shadow tilted his head slightly and turned to the right. Brushing past a row of sorry-eye stalls, he disappeared into a small alley. In a flash, the straw hat disappeared without a trace. The setting sun in the west lost the honor of shining on the East Sea. Miserably, it was blocked off by the various tall buildings in Dongyi and turned into patches of darkness. Fan Xian walked in and covered his tracks. The manor of the master of the city in Dongyi was brightly lit. Although it was not completely night and there was a lingering warmth of the setting sun still shining on the tall eaves of the manor, the servants in the manor had long lit the lamps. It was as if they were all afraid of the arrival of the night in Dongi. In a few days the diplomatic groups from the Qing Kingdom and Northern Qi would arrive in Dongi. Everyone knew that the great Grandmaster of the Sword Hut was about to decide the future direction of Dongi after the opening of the hut. However, everyone knew that once the Sword Saint passed away, no matter what Dongi chose, it would be an endless dark night descending for these common people who were happy in the name of free merchants. Of all these people, the most nervous was the master of Dongi. Regardless of whether Dongi became a territory outside the Qing Kingdom or Northern Qi, there was no need for him, the master of the city in name, to continue to exist. He was the master of the city in name because the true masters of Dongi were Sigujien and the Sword Hut. He only enjoyed the glory and wealth and carried out simple administrative work on behalf of them. The master of the city looked worriedly at the middle-aged swordsman sitting across from him. Faintly he sighed and said, "Master Yun, to say something inauspicious, it looks like the Sword Saint is not going to make it. As the head of the Sword Hut, you have to make a decision." Yun Jilan, the first disciple of the Sword Hut, lowered his head slightly and maintained his silence. After a long time he said, "Teacher knows his limits. There is no need for you to worry too much. Even if I don't worry for myself, I have to worry for the people in this city." The master of the city stared into his eyes and said, "If we really surrender to the Qing Kingdom, at worst, I will go to the Qing Kingdom's Jingdo to be a free and unfettered marquis. Dongi has worked hard to build this city. Are we really going to give it to our enemy, the Qing Emperor, with both hands?" Yun Jilan knew that the master of the city purposely spoke in such a dignified manner because he was worried about his own path of escape once the city fell and the hut fell. If this person actually dared to go to Jingdo to be a free and unfettered marquis, why would he ask him so seriously today? Everyone knew the Qing Emperor's ambition and terrifying ruthlessness. If the master of the city went to be a free and unfettered marquis, he would probably be greeted with a cup of poisoned wine within 2 years. Yun Jilan had to admit that his thoughts were the same as those of the master of the city. As a superior 9th-level ace, he was not worried about his future after the city fell. Presumably, even the Qing Emperor would welcome him. However, he had grown up in Dongi. He had a sense of belonging and love for this city and the Sword Hut that came from the depths of his soul. No matter what, he could not accept Dongi surrendering without a fight and being absorbed into the Qing Kingdom's territory. If they could remain independent of the two powers in the world, it would be Dongi's best future. If the situation could not be reversed, Yun Jilan would rather join hands with the relatively weaker Northern Qi court to fight the Qing Kingdom together. Yun Jilan furrowed his brows slightly. His eyelids fluttered weakly, revealing 2 cold lights that flashed through them. He knew that an important figure was in the Sword Hut having an important conversation with his teacher. If this negotiation was successful, then Dongi would stand up bravely and carry out a decisive resistance against the powerful Qing Kingdom. Yun Jilan raised his eyelids and looked at the master of the city. "I will not surrender." The master of Dongi was slightly startled. It was as if he had not expected the other party to agree so readily. Truthfully speaking, the master of the city had been tossing and turning restlessly these 2 years. No matter what choice he made, it could not make him happy unless Sir Sigujien's injuries recovered and he regained his former might. He looked at Yun Jilan hesitantly and said, "But what exactly does the Sword Saint mean? I haven't seen him for more than 2 years." Yun Jilan did not answer this question. His expression was slightly strange. Even now he, the first disciple of the Sword Hut, was not sure what his teacher was thinking. Was it to fight or surrender? However, he immediately calmed down. Thinking of the major figure in the Sword Hut, he took a deep breath and said, "Presumably the teacher also does not want his life's work to go to waste like this." The master of the city furrowed his brows deeply and glanced at Yun Jilan. Probingly he said, "Everyone under heaven knows that the Sword Saint was injured by the Qing Emperor on Dong Mountain 2.5 years ago. Originally, I, a slow-witted person, would not think that the Sword Saint would turn toward the Qing Kingdom. However, news has gradually come these 2 years that 13th Wang is the Sword Saint's last disciple and is on good terms with the Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian. I don't know what Master Yin thinks of this matter." After these words were said, Yun Jilan's expression became serious. Sternly he said, 13th Wang is my brother disciple. Everything he does is arranged by my teacher. It is precisely because his friendship with Fan Xian was arranged by the Sword Saint that this is what I am most worried about. The master of the city looked at Yun Jilan and said seriously. Yun Jilan sank into silence. In the past, he had also felt a boundless coldness from this arrangement. He had never thought that his always proud and ruthless teacher would, before his death, be willing to put aside his deep hatred and make secret contact with the Qin kingdom. 13th Wang. He sighed in his heart and said to himself, I don't have any objections to you. Even if teacher wants you to take over the sword hut, I will only listen to you. However, the light on the table suddenly dimmed and then brightened, reflecting Yun Jilan's cold face. He knew that the most important thing right now was to not let the Qin kingdom's people disturb the important negotiations in the sword hut. On the sword hut side, he had already arranged for countless aces to lie in wait outside. He had also arranged for many powerful warriors outside the plum garden. Yun Jilan raised his wine cup and took a shallow sip. I have already made arrangements for 13th Wang. Don't worry, master of the city. The master of the city furrowed his brows slightly and said, that is good. As long as it is not the Qin kingdom's Fan Xian coming personally, it is fine. Sir Fan Jr. is still on his way. Yun Jilan's eyes were solemn. Calmly and firmly he said, but if he dares to go find little brother alone, I will keep him there forever. Fan Xian had already arrived. He and the shadow had admired the eaves of the manor like tourists. However, no one on Dongyi's side knew. At the same time, Fan Xian also did not know that the first disciple of the sword hut, Yun Jilan, had begun to protect the sword hut because of his loyalty to Dongyi and himself. He was even willing to harm 13th Wang to keep the Qin kingdom's people forever on this land. At the beginning of the night, Fan Xian came to a courtyard on the outskirts of Dongyi. Looking at the green banner hanging to dry on the low wall, he couldn't resist smiling slightly. Naturally, he did not go forward and directly knock on the door. Instead, he made a few turns and passed through the back of a plum garden, preparing to see 13th Wang, who had been waiting for him. As he walked through the plum blossoms and was about 5 or 6 steps away from the back door, Fan Xian stopped his steps. He didn't hear the barking of the dog in the courtyard. 13th Wang had once told him that he raised a mutt with the best nose when they were chatting. Dogs could be made into dog meat hot pot, but plum blossoms would not be the only one left. Fan Xian's fingers curled slightly. His eyelids lowered as he stared at the plum blossom in front of his feet. He knew there was an ambush here and that the people lying in ambush were all aces. When his figure paused, he felt a gust of wind sweep past in front of him and cut down a plum blossom. Immediately after, powerful sword intents seeped in from all directions. Chapter 628. He was thankful for the days he had spent with 13th Wang holding a green banner and chatting. He was thankful for the loyal dog in the courtyard of the plum garden that could die. At the most dangerous moment, Fan Xian stopped his steps a moment earlier than he should have. He stepped just outside the circle of sword chi. His sudden pause and landing caused one of the aces who had been accumulating power for a long time to finally lose control of the sword intent in his hand. It broke through the air and landed in front of Fan Xian, revealing his figure. A streak of sword intent landed in the air. Immediately after, a number of sharp sword intents followed. Although they had not reached a perfect realm, they still attacked Fan Xian's body from 3 directions like venomous snakes. Fan Xian's left temple felt like it had been pricked by a needle. He blinked his right eye and felt slightly sore. At the same time, he felt the hairs on his right arm begin to stand up one by one. He felt danger. Since the Qin family's attack in the valley and Yen Xiaoyi's arrow pointing at him with his godly bow, this was the most recent and coldest danger. 5 streaks of sword intent. Other than the person who had struck at the plum garden earlier, who was slightly weaker, the other 4 were all aces. At first it was just a calm night in the plum garden. Suddenly, terrifying sword intents seeped out and faintly controlled the directions Fan Xian could escape in. Just as Fan Xian had sighed with emotion earlier, Dongyi was a strange place with as many aces as there were clouds in the sky. 4 9th-level aces had appeared on such a normal night. Such an ambush was truly frightening. However, Fan Xian still had his head and eyelids lowered. Feeling the sword intents in 3 directions around him, he did not move at all. Those 5 swords did not move. The sword intent was initially fierce and vigorous, but it quickly returned to a neutral and peaceful atmosphere. However, this neutral and peaceful atmosphere was mixed with an aura of absolute determination. It was like a few enraged venomous snakes that were lifting their slender and long bodies, slightly leaning backwards, staring at the prey in the field, ready to give it a fatal blow at any time. There was a hissing sound in the air, as if some invisible power was tearing apart the empty space. It formed countless lines condensed from sword chi in the air, cutting the space in front of the plum garden into countless small areas. If someone dared to walk into these areas, they would definitely be cut into countless pieces by the sharp sword qi. It looked like he was just stopping some people from entering 13th Wang's residence, but Fan Xian did not think so. He felt a hidden murderous aura. The reason these swords had been accumulating power and not attacking was because of Fan Xian's miraculous landing at the beginning. This step just so happened to land on the edge of the encirclement, luring out the plum-cutting strike. At the same time, it caused the sword qi formation that had been prepared for a long time to stagnate slightly. These 9th-level swordsmen of the sword hut who were lying in ambush clearly did not know who had come. However, from this step they could see the other's level of cultivation. They knew that if they acted rashly, they would give the other a sliver of an opportunity. Although this opening or opportunity was not large, since it was 4 9th-level aces attacking at the same time, they had no intention of letting the incomer return alive. He could not be the Qing Kingdom's Yi Luyun or that unfathomable emperor. Of the 5 swords, one of them sank into silence. The other 4 remained hidden in the darkness. They slowly changed their angles and aimed in any direction Fan Xian might escape in. They would not move first because the first to move must have a direction. With a direction there would be a loss. This lost opening was something Fan Xian wanted to use. Thus Fan Xian did not move. However, the encirclement of 4 9th-level aces was a rare sight. Even someone as powerful as Fan Xian felt a glimmer of coldness. In this life he had exchanged blows with countless aces. Facing 4 9th-level aces at the same time was something he had never even thought about. No matter how arrogant and conceited he was, he did not have the extravagant hope that he could defeat 4 9th-level aces at the same time. Among these 4 9th-level aces, there were no top 9th-level aces like Yun Jilan, Lang Tiao, or Haitang Duo. Fan Xian's eyes stared at the broken plum blossom in front of his feet. His eyelids were slightly lowered. He appeared calm, but in reality he was already feeling very uncomfortable from the all-pervasive sword qi and omnipresent pressure. His entire spirit had been pressed to the point of rebound or collapse. Sweat slowly began to form on his body. Countless drops of cold sweat slid down his back. The sweat on his forehead followed the angle of his body and slid down the bridge of his nose and brows. A drop of sweat seeped into his eye. It was slightly bitter and stinging, making him blink. The surrounding experts still didn't move, because they knew that the expert they had surrounded couldn't hold on any longer and was about to make the first move. The moment Fan Xian took that step, he knew that he had already obtained an opportunity to escape. However, he didn't know how 13th Wang was in the courtyard, so he stopped his steps. He didn't take the risk and forcefully broke out of the encirclement. He had not thought that the aces lying in ambush outside the plum garden would be so powerful and that Yun Jilan could mobilize so many disciples of the sword hut. Thus, he hid himself in bitter suffering. When the drop of sweat entered his eye, he gave up on the idea of entering the courtyard. Closing his eyes, he gave up on the idea of entering the courtyard. Closing his eyes, he gave a clear whistle and spat out the impure air in his body. His large and small circulations began to circulate wildly. Using the purest tyrannical jinqi in his body, he abruptly charged backward. In the dark night, dust flew up. With a bang, Fan Xian disappeared without a trace. Turning into a gust of wind, he rushed backward. If it had been anyone else among the assassins, they probably would not have been able to react to Fan Xian's tyrannical jinqi circulation speed. They could only watch as he frantically left. However, the assassins were all 9th level, goddamn 9th level. When Fan Xian closed his eyes, a streak of sword qi came lightly from the right side of the sky. The tip of the sword glowed with a cold light as it pierced directly toward his weak eyelids. Fan Xian let out a breath on the sword qi. The sword qi swayed slightly and did not stop. It pierced downward, piercing toward his weak throat. The power of the sword came but did not leave. It pressed forward with an indomitable will. It was the essence of the Sigu sword. Fan Xian's body shook violently and turned into a puff of smoke. Relying on his powerful speed, he forcefully escaped the damage of this sword intent. Almost at the same time, a normal steel sword mysteriously appeared in his path of retreat. Because Fan Xian had retreated quickly, the ace of the sword hut was unable to stop his figure. However, the sword could. This normal steel sword left his hand and flew just in time below the lightning-like figure, slicing horizontally across Fan Xian's left calf. Fan Xian's speed could not be reduced. Once he slowed down, he would be surrounded by the 4 level 9 experts, and he would no longer have a chance to break out of the encirclement. However, the swordsmanship of the Dongyi sword hut disciples was indeed marvelous. In such a high-speed battle situation, The sword that left his hand was still able to accurately and viciously slice toward his calf. It looked like Fan Xian had stupidly used his calf to crash into the blade of the other party's sword. Fan Xian did not slow down. He could not slow down. Unexpectedly, his body twisted forcefully in midair. However, the angle of the twist was too small. It did not affect anything at all. In a flash, his calf struck viciously against the sharp blade of the sword. There was a crisp clang. No one could describe their emotions when they saw this scene because Fan Xian's leg was not broken. On the contrary, it was the mysterious sword blocking his path that seemed to have been struck by a heavy hammer. It fell abruptly to the ground and rolled uncontrollably. Fan Xian's calf had been struck heavily. His entire body also rolled through the air. Now he was facing the darkness of the plum garden, the only gap in the darkness that he could escape through. Right in front of the gap was an old plum tree. There were no flowers on the tree. There were only old and broken branches. Like a dragon's beard, it twisted and trembled endlessly. Fan Xian used his fastest speed to crash toward this old plum tree. As long as he charged through this gap, he would be able to safely enter the darkness. In the end, he had still underestimated the ace of the sword hut. 2 of the 4 ninth-level swords had already come out. The other 2 had already silently calculated Fan Xian's path of retreat and arrived behind the old plum tree in the darkness. Fan Xian, who was crashing toward the old plum tree at high speed, narrowed his eyes slightly. A cold light flashed through them as he looked at the 2 green-clothed men behind the tree and the swords in their hands that were slowly stabbing toward the old plum tree trunk. The slow stabbing was just an illusion of time. In such a high-speed process, it was difficult for a human's strength to reverse the situation. The 2 swords appeared to be moving forward with an indomitable will and stupidly stabbing toward the air behind the old plum tree. Fan Xian knew that these 2 swords were very powerful and had accurately found that point. The point where the tips of the swords and Fan Xian's body would meet. Given Fan Xian's tyrannical martial method and the trajectory he had forcefully increased his speed to crash toward the old plum tree, he would certainly come into the most intimate contact with the tips of the 2 swords. He thought for a long time. In reality, it was only for a moment when he rode the white horse past the mouth of the alley. The hard old plum tree trunk lay in front of Fan Xian's body. When it came into contact, it became soft like a steel bar had become soft to wrap around a finger. Fan Xian's momentum crashed toward the old plum tree. His body pressed the old plum tree forward. He was getting closer and closer to the tips of the 2 swords that seemed to have found an opening in the plum garden. No one could change any of this. In the next moment, Fan Xian would be pierced through the chest by these 2 wondrous swords. However, the old plum tree changed everything. The trunk of the plum tree slowly changed shape. The bark behind it had already been shattered by the 2 sword intense close at hand, but it did not break or shatter. It continued to block Fan Xian's body behind it. It was as if it did not want Fan Xian to receive any harm. The eyes of the 2 green-clothed disciples of the sword hut suddenly lit up. It was as if they were seeing something they had never seen in their lives. The plum tree had bent to the point where wood could bend, but it still did not break. Fan Xian's tyrannical momentum was clearly ruthless, so why had this plum tree not broken? The tip of the swords gently touched the trunk of the old plum tree. With 2 soft sounds, the sword intense moved up the tree and pierced toward Fan Xian's heart meridian. However, Fan Xian's tyrannical momentum had long ceased to exist. His entire person was like a leaf attached to the plum tree. It was as if he was a part of this old plum tree. Strangely, the plum tree bounced back, bringing Fan Xian, who was like a leaf, back. He just happened to avoid the 2 swords that the green-clothed disciples of the sword hut had been accumulating for a long time. With countless cracking sounds, the old plum tree, under the attack of the 2 green steel swords, turned into a sky full of splinters. Fan Xian was already flying violently back in the direction he had come through the sky full of splinters. Turning into a gray dragon, he swept past the completely unprepared aces of the sword hut behind him like a bolt of lightning. Viciously, he crashed into the wooden door of the courtyard and charged into the room. The 2 green-clothed aces of the sword hut behind the pieces of the old plum tree met each other's eyes. A strange light flashed through their calm eyes. They knew who had come. Other than a faint excitement, they couldn't help but feel a powerful sense of admiration. At first, it was as tyrannical as wild thunder. Once it touched the old plum tree and saw the hidden swords, it became as gentle as a cool breeze, gently brushing against the tree trunk. Going with the flow, it miraculously avoided the 2 swords of the sword hut. Using the force of the rebound in an instant, the cool breeze once again became a ruthless hurricane. Unexpectedly, it crashed back into the courtyard where 13th Wang lived. The sword hut aces lying in ambush all thought that Fan Xian wanted to escape. No one had thought that his retreat, which he had been accumulating power for a long time, was actually an ambush for his final charge into the courtyard. No one had thought that Fan Xian would have the courage to not retreat when faced with the ambush of 4 ninth-level aces of the sword hut. In such a short amount of time, he had made such a complicated plan. He had even calculated the old plum tree in his path of retreat and the possible responses the aces of the sword hut might make. Fan Xian's simple retreat and advance contained a great deal of life and death experience and determination when facing an enemy. What shocked and impressed the aces of the sword hut the most was Fan Xian's ability to change the nature of his jinqi as he wished. If Fan Xian did not have such a miraculous ability, when he first came into contact with the old plum tree, he would have smashed through the plum tree and fallen into the 2 swords that had been accumulating power for a long time. In this world, no one had ever been able to simultaneously cultivate in 2 completely different yet top-notch jinqi methods within the scope of each other, much less someone like Fan Xian, who was able to switch between the tyrannical method and the natural method so naturally and effortlessly. Thus, the 2 green-clothed aces met each other's eyes and saw the shock and admiration in each other's eyes. In this world, only Sir Fan Jr. had practiced the Qing Emperor's tyrannical true method and the natural method of Northern Qi's Tianyi Dao. The aces on Dongyi's side had studied this intelligence report for a long time. Even they had not thought that Fan Xian would be able to use these 2 kinds of jinqi methods at the same time in an instant. Thus, contrary to all the warrior's expectations, he had cleverly found an opening. In this world only Fan Xian, a freak, had 2 cycles of circulation. Fan Xian crashed into the courtyard and charged into the back room. He saw 13th Wang sitting cross-legged on the bed with a sallow complexion and soulless, sunken eyes. It was clear that 13th Wang had been poisoned. For some reason, seeing this scene, Fan Xian's heart was filled with anger. Like a gust of wind, he charged to the side of the bed. With a flick of his right finger, he stabbed toward the woman by 13th Wang's side who was holding a sword to his throat. Fan Xian charged in too quickly. It was clear that the woman had not thought that her 5 sect uncles would not be able to kill the enemy even when they attacked at the same time. On the contrary, he had charged into the inner courtyard. Her face was full of shock and confusion. She had no time to react. She could only watch as Fan Xian's powerful finger pierced straight toward her vitals. She was about to die. Suddenly, a glimmer of pain flashed through 13th Wang's eyes. Fan Xian's expression did not change, but his heart darkened slightly. His finger pulled back slightly. The wind in his finger deviated slightly and struck the female disciple of the sword hut on the left side of her chest. The female disciple gave a muffled grunt and fell onto the bed. She sank into unconsciousness. There was no time to say anything. Outside, there were still 4 ninth-level aces of the sword hut in pursuit. Fan Xian did not ask why 13th Wang had been poisoned. He only silently picked him up and stomped viciously on the bed with the tip of his foot. With a crash, the large carved wooden bed collapsed. Fan Xian's figure followed the direction he had come from and charged out of the courtyard. 1 retreat, 1 advance, and 1 retreat. Fan Xian's choice of direction 3 times in a row was very strange. It did not conform to common sense at all and was completely outside of the sword hut aces' expectations. The 4 ninth-level aces of the sword hut saw Fan Xian enter the courtyard. Their hearts were filled with fear, admiration, anger, and complicated emotions. They immediately calculated that he would certainly take their youngest disciple and break through the wall at the back of the courtyard to break out. They had not thought that Fan Xian would stupidly carry 13th Wang and charge out from the direction of the main door. The 3 ninth-level aces and the 8th-level disciple had already flown up like large birds toward the direction of the courtyard. They hoped to block Fan Xian's path in the shortest amount of time possible. However, while they were in midair, they discovered with unusual shock that Fan Xian had brushed past them on the ground and was charging toward the plum garden. The green-clothed swordsman with powerful sword techniques was shocked. With a loud whistle, he used his brilliant cultivation to forcefully turn around in the night sky. Kicking the moon in the sky, his entire body drew an arc in the air and stabbed toward Fan Xian's back. He was worried that 13th Wang was on Fan Xian's back, so the tip of his sword was aimed at the back of Fan Xian's head. Kicking the moon and stabbing through the air, this strike was free and at ease. Outside the front door of the courtyard, there was another green-clothed swordsman holding a sword with both hands. His expression was cautious. His elbows were slightly bent. Using the stance of a straight sword, he stabbed toward Fan Xian's face. It was still these 2 green-clothed swordsmen. It was still Fan Xian. However, It had become two green-clothed swordsmen attacking Fan Xian from the front and back. Fan Xian lowered his head and charged forward. It was as if he did not care at all about the strike that was stabbing toward the back of his head. His eyes stared viciously at the green-clothed swordsman at the door. It was as if he wanted to use his gaze to stab the other party to death. Right at this moment, an unexpected event occurred. Fan Xian's footsteps were like iron hammers striking the ground. With each step, smoke and dust rose into the air. In a flash, the smoke and dust had filled the area in front of the plum garden, enveloping his figure and that of the green-clothed swordsman in front of the door. The green-clothed swordsman flying through the air behind him suddenly realized that Fan Xian's body had become somewhat indistinct. His state of mind was not at all panicked. He continued to stab forward with his flying sword. Suddenly he felt his left eye twitch strangely. It was as if he felt some kind of extreme fear. There was an additional shadow under the moonlight. Was it his own shadow? Fan Xian charged into the smoke. The black dagger was already in his hand. The sword light scattered. The green-clothed swordsman in the smoke also had his sword in his hand. The sword light scattered. Each of them focused on what was in front of them and did not care about what was behind them. They used each other's sword intent to the extreme. A glimmer of panic suddenly flashed through the green-clothed swordsman's eyes. A deep wound had been cut under his left armpit. For some reason, this person's state of mind had panicked and allowed Fan Xian to charge through. A shadow floated past in the sky. The other green-clothed swordsman let out a sharp cry and forcefully stopped the momentum of the moonlight kick. His sword slashed horizontally, but he completely cut empty air. Immediately after, he felt a chill in the left side of his chest. His jinqi immediately dissipated. Sharp pain rose as he fell to the ground. The smoke dissipated. The 4 ninth-level disciples of the Sword Hut gathered in front of the plum garden. 2 of them were injured. The other 2 stood in a daze. Looking at the empty ground in front of the courtyard, they didn't know what to say for a long time. No one had thought that the 2 ninth-level swordsmen the Sword Hut was most proud of would be injured by the other party's sword in one move. They believed that even if Yun Jilan had personally acted, or if their youngest disciple had not been poisoned, he would not have been able to injure them with just one strike. What happened? A 9th-level disciple of the Sword Hut looked at the 3rd and 4th brother disciples sitting on the ground with a face full of shock. The 2 green-clothed swordsmen were the 3rd and 4th brother disciples with the deepest cultivation in the Sword Hut. The Sword Hut had 13 disciples, but 12 of them were 9th-level swordsmen. Among them, the 3rd and 4th brother disciples were the best of the best. They could not believe the scene they were seeing. The left armpit of the 3rd disciple of the Sword Hut had been cut by Fan Xian's black dagger. It was not a serious injury. However, his mind was already scattered, which allowed Fan Xian to carry 13th Wang out. The 4th disciple's injury was even more serious. A sword had pierced his chest. Fortunately, it had not pierced his heart, but fresh blood flowed. It looked terrifying. The 2 green-clothed swordsmen met each other's eyes again. There was no longer admiration for Fan Xian's strength in their eyes. Instead, there was true fear. The smoke is poisonous. They still had a big secret they had not said. Sir Fan Jr. of the Southern Court was a master of poisons. Dongyi knew this. Even if Fan Xian's use of his feet to spread out the poison earlier was a marvelous skill, the 3rd disciple of the Sword Hut should not have been defeated by him in one move. Although the 4th disciple of the Sword Hut, who had kicked at the moon and faintly understood the essence of the Sigu sword, had been suddenly attacked by the assassin hiding in the shadows by the door to the courtyard, he should not have been injured to such an extent. The 2 green-clothed swordsmen slowly lowered their heads and digested the shock in their hearts. They knew this matter was too important. They had to report it to their teacher. Their defeat in one move earlier was not completely due to their strength. Rather, it was due to the shock that one strike in that shadow had given them. Fan Xian of the Southern Court knew where the door to the Sigu sword was. The assassin hidden in the darkness had used the most authentic Sigu sword. Furthermore, the sword intent was even sharper and more bloodthirsty. Chapter 629. A clear and bright moon shone on Dongyi, which was made up of endless buildings and strange shadows. The light was not very dazzling. Combined with the slightly salty sea breeze blowing in from the harbor outside the city, it filled the air with an enchanting scent. It was like someone had thrown a dried salt plum into a clear cup of wuliangya. It suffused with a light green color and sinisterly hid a pungent killing intent in its fragrance. The back door of a 2-story private residence opened silently. The shadows of 2 people stacked on top of each other passed through like a gust of wind. Immediately after, the people behind the door closed it. At the same time, a few secret signals came from outside the residence indicating that it was safe and there were no traces of anyone. This was a secret stronghold of the 4th Bureau of the Qin Kingdom's Overwatch Council in Dongyi. The owner of the painting and calligraphy shop responsible for this stronghold had been waiting there the entire night. Unexpectedly, an injured person had arrived. After he opened the door, he nervously tightened his grip on the dagger in his hand and sat motionlessly behind the back door. He carefully paid attention to the movements around the stronghold, making sure that if things went wrong, he would be able to call the police at the first instant. The moonlight spilling into the courtyard suddenly dimmed. The owner of the painting and calligraphy shop raised his eyes nervously but didn't find anything unusual. He also didn't notice a shadow floating in through a crack in the wooden door on the 2nd floor of the residence. Inside the room, Fan Xian placed 13th Wang on the bed. He stared at the pale green color on his face and carefully observed it for a moment. He then pried open his lips and looked at the coating of his tongue. He then tilted his ear to listen to his pulse and lungs. His brows slowly furrowed together. To be able to scatter the powerful 13th Wang's Jinqi and make his entire body weak and powerless, this kind of poison had to be a terrifying thing. There was too little time. Fan Xian was still unable to accurately determine what kind of medicine the first disciple of the Sword Hut, Yun Jilan, had given 13th Wang. However, he had a general understanding of the medicine's general composition and effects. He thought for a moment and then took out a small bag that never left his body. Choosing a slightly brown medicine blade, he crushed it with 2 fingers and stuffed it between 13th Wang's lips. Then he fetched half a pot of cold water from the table and forced it down his throat. The cold water soaked the front of 13th Wang's clothes. However, this brave warrior, who had killed the left virtuous prince of the Western Hu and was still able to kill his way out of the king's tent, did not have any reaction. He had already fainted. A glimmer of coldness flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. Pressing his dry lips together, he pressed and brushed his palm across 13th Wang's chest. His hand moved like a ripple of water. He sent Jinqi slightly to help 13th Wang swallow the water for the medicine. After doing all this, Fan Xian finally relaxed slightly. He sat silently by 13th Wang's side and waited for the medicine. He glanced at the shadow beside the door and remained silent. He seemed to be thinking about another very important question. By Fan Wang the water. With Qi he and suddenly he, Qi he. With Fan he. With he. By he with he yun, Fan he. E Wang he. In Jiangnan the meridians in Fan Xian's body had all shattered. It was only with the help of Begonia Duodua's Tianyi Dao martial method that he was able to repair them. Although 13th Wang was deeply poisoned, his meridians were a mess from the invasion of poison, and one could faintly feel that his blood vessels were riddled with holes. He was at least much easier to treat than Fan Xian had been in the past. It was impossible for the medicine to completely purge the poison in 13th Wang's body. Adding on Fan Xian's healing Jinqi, it was another result. Fei Jie had left, Shaoan had died, and Dongyi's poison master was nowhere to be found. In this world, Fan Xian could be said to be the foremost expert in using and curing poisons. Although Yun Jilan's medicine was powerful, it was not difficult for him. The shadow stood silently by the door, waiting for the matter of treating the poison. He looked coldly at 13th Wang, whose face was growing redder and redder. No one knew what he was thinking. After an indeterminable amount of time, 13th Wang finally opened his eyes and woke up. In the instant he woke up, he did not look at Fan Xian, who had worked hard to treat him. Instead, 2 chilling sharp lights seeped out of his eyes and pierced toward the middle-aged man in the shadows by the door. 13th Wang didn't know who the middle-aged man was. He only knew that he was about 40 years old. He had once met him by chance in Qingzhou and knew that he was Fan Xian's trusted aide. 13th Wang had thought that the middle-aged man, whose height couldn't be seen, was a secret agent of the Overwatch Council. Earlier, before he had fainted on Fan Xian's back, he had clearly seen the sword strike the middle-aged man had sent toward his 4th disciple brother in the moonlight. Sigu sword. The secret of the Sword Hut was never taught to outsiders. Only the 13 personal disciples of the Sword Hut could practice the Sigu sword. Who exactly are you? 13th Wang was weak, but his gaze was cautious and complicated. He stared at the shadow and asked in a raspy voice. Fan Xian slowly pulled back his palms from 13th Wang's back. He had used up too much of his Jinqi. The sweat on his body flowed like syrup. His face was covered in sweat. He heard 13th Wang's shocked and nervous question and furrowed his brows slightly. He had not thought that 13th Wang would return to the sword hut's position right after escaping death's door and develop a powerful enmity and attention toward the shadow. The shadow lowered his head slightly and focused his gaze on the tips of his feet. He did not reply to 13th Wang's question. Perhaps he found it uninteresting, boring, or disdainful. He was Sigu Jian's younger brother. Naturally, he found it absurd to be questioned by Sigu Jian's youngest disciple. In the entire world, there were no more than 4 people who knew his true identity. Before Fan Xian gave his permission, the shadow would not let anyone know of his connection to the sword hut. Following the shadow's forced action, this massive secret would probably arouse the guesses of many people. Fan Xian moved from the back of the bed and lowered his head to sit by 13th Wang's side. Burying his head between his shoulders, he appeared particularly tired. The sweat on his body gave off waves of an unpleasant smell. 13th Wang did not thank him. He only stared fixedly at the shadow like a tiger. It seemed that if the shadow did not give him an answer, even though he was extremely weak and had just been restrained by the sword hut's brothers using sinister methods, he would still attack the shadow in the name of the sword hut. Fan Xian lowered his head and raised the index finger of his right hand to sniff gently. The tip of his finger carried the sweat that had been forced out of 13th Wang's body. It had a slightly oily feel to it. He immediately identified the composition of the medicine. His heart thumped. Murderous intent flared in his eyes. What a powerful poison. 13, your eldest disciple brother truly loves you. After these words were said, 13th Wang fell silent and had nothing to say in response. After all, it was the 2 aces of the Qin kingdom who had saved him from the hands of his own brothers. Fan Xian suddenly waved his hand and said tiredly, "This poison is too powerful. I don't have any suitable medicine on hand. Just using Jinqi to force out the poison is not enough. You'll need at least a few more days to recover. If you have any questions, ask them when you wake up tomorrow." 13th Wang coughed violently as if he was not satisfied. He felt his eyelids grow heavier and heavier as he fell toward the bed. Fan Xian flipped his hand and pulled out the thin needle from 13th Wang's neck. Shaking his head, he sat up from the side of the bed. Picking up half a pot of cold tea, he poured it into his stomach and broke out in a sweat. He felt even more tired. He pushed open the door and sat in the shadows under the eaves. The shadow also came to his side. "Fortunately, you came just now." After a moment of silence, Fan Xian quietly said, "Otherwise, I really don't know if I would have been able to come back alive." Thinking of the 4 9th-level cold swords in the sword hut and the seemingly carefree but actually dangerous situation just now, Fan Xian felt a lingering fear and coldness in his heart. Indeed, he could not underestimate the heroes of the world. Although he was not afraid of anyone in a one-on-one fight, being surrounded and attacked by a few 9th-level aces was truly terrifying. Furthermore, he couldn't bear to leave 13th Wang behind. If the shadow had not suddenly appeared in that patch of moonlight, who knew what fate he would face today? After parting at the Sori ice stand, Fan Xian had given the shadow an order to contact the Overwatch Council spy lying in ambush in Dongyi. He had gone alone to the Plum Garden courtyard. He had not thought that the shadow would be able to complete the mission so quickly and return to his side to save his life. "Before dealing with the affairs of the 6th Bureau, I am first a shadow," the shadow said coldly by his side. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He knew what the other party meant. In the past he had been Qin Pingping's shadow, so he never left Qin Pingping's side. Later, Qin Pingping ordered him to come and protect him, so he had become his inseparable shadow. Even though Fan Xian had been careless and had the shadow deal with council affairs, if he left his side for a short moment, the shadow would still feel a powerful sense of unease and choose to find Fan Xian as quickly as possible. His style of doing things was to follow behind Fan Xian in secret and protect him at all times. The sea breeze blew, making the sweat on Fan Xian's body even colder. It made him involuntarily shiver. He was already a superior 9th-level ace and had long been immune to the cold and heat. However, he shivered at this moment. It was enough to prove the coldness in his heart. The coldness in his heart was because of the internal strife in the sword hut. Yun Jilan had attacked 13th Wang so viciously. Furthermore, there were so many aces of the sword hut standing at his side. Had the dying Sigu Jian already lost control of the sword hut? The coldness was also because of the dangerous situation earlier. The sweat on his body was not only caused by forcing out the poison for 13th Wang, but also because of the 4 terrifying swords. Fan Xian was still shaken. There was something he was even more afraid of. This matter weighed down on his heart and made it difficult for him to breathe. Terror took over his entire heart and body. It was clear that the shadow knew what he was afraid of, so he also appeared to have an unprecedentedly serious expression. Sitting by his side, he didn't say a word. The scene made Fan Xian think of many years ago when he had first come to Jiangnan. Under the eaves of the Shazhou Inn, he and the foremost assassin in the world had sat side by side. Although their conversation was not joyful, they had gained a great deal. Now they were sitting next to each other again. Both of their moods were heavy. "Why didn't you kill that sword hut ace just now?" Fan Xian's voice had become dry because of his nervousness. They had 4 9th-level aces. "We were able to pass through them in one move by catching them off guard and using sword intent to intimidate their state of mind," the shadow said with his eyes closed. "Even so, I could only seriously injure one person. You didn't truly injure the third prince. If they had come to their senses, perhaps we would have been able to escape, but we still wouldn't have been able to kill them all. I have to admit that my idiot brother's ability to teach disciples is the best in the world." The shadow's words described a truth that everyone knew. Of the 4 great grandmasters, Yi Luyun did not accept disciples. The Qing emperor probably had a strange disciple like Fan Xian. Although Ku He's Tianyi Dao had many disciples, the only one who had truly raised countless aces was Sigu Jian. Just under the sword hut, there were 12 9th-level aces. This was an astonishing number. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly said, "I have been very careful these 3 years. Once I use Sigu sword, someone will certainly die under my sword. I have never let a living person see me use Sigu sword moves. There has never been anyone alive under my sword." The shadow coldly stated the truth. Whenever the foremost assassin in the world drew his sword, there had never been anyone alive. "What about Yun Jilan?" Fan Xian brought up a name. 3 years ago in Jiangnan, the shadow had led the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau to chase and kill the disciples of the sword hut led by Yun Jilan. They had forced the dark powers of Dongyi out of Suzhou and Hangzhou, contributing greatly to Fan Xian's order in Jiangnan. "When I killed Yun Jilan, I did not use the original sword," the shadow replied after a moment of silence. Fan Xian gently nodded his head. Even when the shadow had attacked Yun Jilan on the West Lake fishing boat outside the Hangzhou building, he had only heavily injured him. It looked like the shadow was also worried that he would not be able to kill Yun Jilan, so he had held back to avoid revealing his identity. "That is why in the entire world only these 5 people tonight know 6. If you add 13th Wang, that is 7 people who might know this secret." Fan Xian lowered his head and thought. "The problem is, we still have no way of silencing these people. When do you think Sigu Jian will guess that you are his lucky surviving brother?" The shadow was silent for a long time. He then slowly said, "Perhaps a long time ago, he already knew that the shadow of the Overwatch Council was me." After these words were said, Fan Xian sank into a helpless calm. He knew that the thing he feared the most would perhaps become a reality because of this trip to Dongyi. He raised his head to gaze at the bright moon and lowered it to think of his hometown. He muttered, "If Sigu Jian could help us keep this a secret, how good would that be?" The shadow glanced at him and didn't say anything, but the sense of ridicule could not be hidden. Fan Xian suddenly let out a long sigh. Gazing at the shadow, he asked with a slight smile, "How did it feel to assassinate the emperor in the Hanging Temple?" The shadow thought for a moment and then said, "It felt pretty good." Fan Xian shrugged and didn't say anything more. On the day of the assassination in the Hanging Temple, the emperor had revealed that the assassin was Sigu Jian's younger brother who had left home at a young age. Everyone knew that the Qing emperor was a great grandmaster, so his judgment would not be wrong. If Sigu Jian guessed that the shadow was his younger brother through the reports of his disciples and this news traveled back to the Qing kingdom, the head of the Overwatch Council's 6th Bureau, the shadow, had assassinated the Qing emperor. Would Qin Pingping still be able to sit properly in his wheelchair? This was the thing that Fan Xian and the shadow were most afraid of. Both of them had respect and love for the lonely old cripple from the depths of their hearts. Coming back to their senses, they regretted revealing a flaw in the moment earlier, a flaw that exposed the Overwatch Council's biggest secret. "Perhaps things are not as bad as we think," Fan Xian suddenly said calmly. Fan Xian suddenly calmly said, "Tomorrow I want to see Sigu Jian and discuss business with him. I want to discuss this matter as well." Just as Fan Xian had thought and said, this matter would not necessarily affect the Qing kingdom. However, he was carefully making preparations. The official business of this trip to Dongyi required him to carefully handle it. If he handled this matter well, perhaps all the problems would be resolved with the wind. "We are friends." Fan Xian drank the thin porridge as he looked at 13th Wang, who was sitting by the bed with a pale face and injuries that had not yet healed. 13th Wang thought for a moment and then nodded. Fan Xian put down the bowl of porridge and said seriously, "If you don't want to lose me your friend, then starting from today, don't say a word about everything that happened last night. Don't ask." 13th Wang nodded his head again. Although Fan Xian told him not to ask, he had to ask clearly about what had happened in Dongyi yesterday and a few days before. He used the tip of his finger to tap the table, indicating for 13th Wang to eat some porridge to nourish his stomach. Weighing his words, he said, "Yesterday, I dared to go alone to the plum garden to find you. It's not that I didn't think that Yun Jilan would send people to keep an eye on that place. Presumably, you know that I had the Overwatch Council send people to keep an eye on your residence. The biggest problem is that, given your strength, I thought that even if something tragic happened in the Sword Hut, you would have the ability to notify my subordinates or leave some traces for me." Fan Xian stared into 13th Wang's eyes. "Last night I was almost surrounded and killed. This problem was caused by you. I don't understand how you could be trapped in a room and defeated so badly." Hearing these words, a glimmer of pain flashed through 13th Wang's eyes. It looked like the brothers in the sect had secretly taken action against him. It made even this young ace, who had a bright temperament, feel an unbearable pain. A moment later, 13th Wang said in a raspy voice, "3 days ago, eldest brother invited me to drink. We talked about the future of Dongyi. At the banquet, he was very excited, but I had no face to face him because I knew that what eldest brother said and did was correct. But your actions were arranged by Sigujian. You had no way of resisting." Fan Xian cut him off. 13th Wang was silent for a moment and then said, "Yes, if it weren't for teacher's orders, I would rather raise my sword against the Qing army than be like this, a role that my brothers spurn. It doesn't feel good to be a traitor, does it?" The corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched slightly as he spoke with a smile. In his heart he was thinking of himself. 13th Wang didn't quite understand the meaning of the word traitor. He shook his head and said, "I believe teacher is thinking for the future of Dongyi and the millions of people. Furthermore, no one knows what exactly teacher will do." He paused for a moment, then continued, "There were only me and eldest senior brother at the banquet. You know, before I came out of seclusion, although I had never seen senior brother in these 2 years, we have a very good relationship. I even see him as my own brother." Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "So, he gave you poison wine to drink and you drank it in one gulp." A pained expression flashed through 13th Wang's eyes. In a trembling voice he said, "Eldest brother is not such a treacherous person. I know he poisoned me for Dongyi. He doesn't want you Qing people to see teacher through my channels." "You are too naive and unaffected," Fan Xian sighed and said. "In this world, if you don't kill people, then others kill you. With your personality, if you want to control the Sword Hut, it is no different from a fool's dream. Eldest brother doesn't want to kill me. He only wants to kill you and break a possible agreement," 13th Wang suddenly said angrily as he stared at Fan Xian. Fan Xian's heart suddenly softened. Warmly he said, "I believe that. I've investigated the poison. Although it is harmful to your body, as long as you don't rashly use your jinqi, it will not be fatal. Yun Jilan and the other brothers of the Sword Hut still have good intentions toward you." Fan Xian's words were actually just to comfort 13th Wang. Perhaps even he didn't want to see the purest of the aces of the younger generation have his soul clouded by such filthy things. Yun Jilan trapped you with the intention of killing the Qing kingdom's liaison. Furthermore, the scouts earlier reported that the Sword Hut is heavily guarded and forbids anyone from entering. It is clear that the people from northern Qi have already entered the Sword Hut and are beginning to try to persuade your teacher," Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, "What I want to know now is, who exactly is the important figure from northern Qi?" "I don't know," 13th Wang said straightforwardly. 13th Wang said straightforwardly, "This matter was arranged by eldest brother from the beginning. Furthermore, I've been poisoned these few days and have been locked up in the courtyard. I want to see Sigujian. Is there any way?" Fan Xian stared into his eyes. 13th Wang's expression was slightly desolate. "I haven't seen teacher in 10 days. I don't know how his body is and if he can hold on." Fan Xian heard that he didn't answer his question at all and felt angry. However, he knew there was nothing he could do. With a cold smile he said, "A major figure from northern Qi. Do you really think I can't guess who it is? Although the Sword Hut is heavily guarded, Yun Jilan cannot cover the sky with one hand. If you walk openly into the Sword Hut, will second brother, who has always maintained a neutral position, just watch as someone else kills you in front of the Sword Hut?" 13th Wang looked at him like he was looking at a ghost and said, "Last night, you were almost killed by my brothers. Are you going to go to your death again today? Fan Xian fell silent. He had to see this eccentric great-grandmaster before Northern Qi convinced Sigu Jian. Furthermore, it concerned the life of the person he cared about the most. If he didn't go to his death, many people in the world would die. You are the 13th disciple of the Sword Hut. You will always have some way in Dongi. I will send someone from the Overwatch Council to help you. Even if I can't enter the Sword Hut today, I must still see that major figure from Northern Qi. A strange, unfathomable expression flashed through Fan Xian's eyes. It was as if he had great confidence in how to deal with this major figure from Northern Qi. A pale-faced young man walked down from the carriage with great difficulty. Looking at the rows of grass huts in the distance, countless complicated emotions rose in his eyes. He tidied his clothes and walked toward them. The various disciples of the Sword Hut responsible for defending looked at this person's expression and appearance. Shock appeared on their faces. Some people unconsciously stretched their hands to their waists and gripped the hilts of their swords, but no one dared to make the first move. Someone called out in a slightly dry voice, "Uncle disciple, teacher has ordered that the patriarch is cultivating in seclusion and is not to be disturbed." Gradually, people came over and surrounded 13th Wang in the center. All of the disciples of the Sword Hut knew that Master Yun Jilan, who handled all the affairs of the sect, had many problems with this uncle disciple who was most favored by the patriarch. Last night, the uncle disciple had been rescued. Everyone had guessed whether or not it was an ace from the Qin kingdom. No one had thought that with the sun in the sky, the uncle disciple would walk to the door of the Sword Hut like this. Everyone was nervous. They didn't know if they should immediately take him down or what. 13th Wang took a deep breath. His expression was calm but filled with boundless determination. Just like this, he walked step by step toward the Sword Hut. Then he saw a person he wanted to see a lot. Lowering his body in a bow, he said, "Second brother, I want to see teacher." The second sword of the Sword Hut did not participate in this matter. He looked at 13th Wang with a glimmer of pity and quietly said, "Brother, go back." Just as there was chaos in front of the Sword Hut, a person silently slipped through the shadows at the foot of the mountain outside a quiet and secluded courtyard at the back of the Sword Hut. The attention of the disciples of the Sword Hut was completely drawn by the valiant appearance of 13th Wang. No one noticed this. This quiet and secluded courtyard was used by the Sword Hut to receive their most honored guests. However, that guest was inside the Sword Hut, so the defenses of the courtyard were not very strong. The figure easily passed through. Dodging the aces the Northern Qi side had brought, Fan Xian was like a leopard cat as he made his way to the back of the courtyard. Smelling the faint fragrance that he would remember for the rest of his life, he came to a room and floated in. Looking at the woman facing the mirror who was wearing yellow flowers and relaxing the resentment of a serving girl, he couldn't resist smiling. He walked up behind the woman and bent down to gently blow a breath of air into her ear. With incomparable frivolity he said, "Lily, do you miss a man?" The woman's entire body shook. Looking at her charming, resentful and incomparably beautiful self in the mirror, as well as the unforgettable face next to it that was no less beautiful than her own, she was so shocked that she couldn't say a word. Sir Fan Jr. It had been a number of years since she had seen the owner of that face. Why had he appeared so mysteriously in Dongi beside the Sword Hut, and by her side? Lily abruptly turned around. Her eyes were wide with fear as she looked at Fan Xian who had appeared beside her like a ghost. She opened her mouth but forcefully suppressed it. She didn't make a sound. Her flowing and gentle eyes were filled with shock. Fan Xian was very satisfied with this woman's behavior. He smiled slightly and quietly said, "Looks like he really dotes on you. Such an important matter, yet he still brings you with him. Is he afraid you'll make him a cuckold?" Lily gripped the corners of her sleeves. Her entire body trembled slightly, but her lips were pressed tightly together. There was fear in her eyes. She and Fan Xian were old acquaintances. Back then they had traveled north and met in prison. How could she not know what kind of person Sir Fan Jr. was? Although he appeared gentle on the outside, he was actually cruel and merciless. At this moment he was in a dangerous situation. If she made the slightest movement, he would probably not care at all about their past friendship and ruthlessly destroy a flower. Fan Xian gently grabbed her chin. Where his hand touched, it was smooth. His thoughts floated back to the carriage that had traveled north. His heart swayed slightly. In a quiet voice he said, "Do you want us to sew a cuckold for your family's emperor?" Lily's fear faded slightly. She pressed her lips together and smiled. Back then she had been the foremost beauty in Jingdo. Now she had become a northern Qi imperial concubine and was deeply favored by the Qi emperor. She had been influenced by endless nobility and had become even more beautiful. With this smile, her eyes flowed like water. It was very alluring. Fan Xian also smiled. It was indeed very convenient to interact with a woman who knew his background. He smiled slightly and raised his hand in invitation. Sea Lily smiled bitterly and placed her hand in his large one. They walked behind the curtain. Sea Lily was too familiar with his style of doing things. She knew that under these circumstances, he would not be fooling around. He only wanted to borrow her room to wait for the person he had been waiting for. For some reason, when her hand was placed in Fan Xian's warm hand, she let out a long sigh in her heart. It was as if she had fulfilled a long-cherished wish of many years and was incomparably satisfied. In that instant, she had not thought about whether or not that person would encounter any danger when he returned in a moment. After a long time, or perhaps it was very short, a wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the room. A very young man entered the room under the protection of many people. This man's eyebrows were like two swords, and his eyes were like the ocean. He wore plain clothes with a bright yellow sash tied around his waist. He walked with a majestic gait and a natural aura. "Your Majesty, Lady Lily is not here. Perhaps she has gone to play in the garden," a eunuch disguised as a servant reported in a sharp voice. The young man seemed to have something troubling his mind. He made a light sound of acknowledgement and sat down on a chair. Out of habit he crossed his legs. A eunuch had long taken off his boots. Chapter 630. The Northern Qi Emperor was personally attending Sigu Jian's opening ceremony of the Sword Hut. Although this was certainly the last time Sigu Jian appeared in the world, the great Grandmaster's position was respected. Furthermore, this opening ceremony would determine the future ownership of Dongyi. For Northern Qi it was very important. For the Northern Qi Emperor, as an emperor, to deign to come was still a shocking matter. Other than Fan Xian who had already guessed it. He narrowed his eyes behind the curtain and looked through the layers of gauze at the young but shrewd Northern Qi Emperor. He knew that Northern Qi would place great importance on Sigu Jian's death, particularly when the Qin kingdom was powerful. If the Northern Qi people wanted to reverse the situation, they had to make a more powerful response. The Northern Qi Emperor personally coming to persuade Sigu Jian represented Northern Qi's absolute sincerity. For an emperor to leave his own capital and quietly come to a foreign country, who knew how much danger he had to take. This move was truly too daring. Even though Fan Xian had long guessed the Northern Qi Emperor's unconventional move when he was in Yanjing, seeing the emperor appear beside the sword hut with his own eyes still made it difficult for him to suppress his shock and admiration. The mountain courtyard of the sword hut was quiet and secluded. Who knew how many aces of the Northern Qi court were hidden outside, as well as the defensive power of the sword hut? It seemed that no one had expected that in the center of the defense, the Qin kingdom's Fan Xian, who worried the Northern Qi people the most, had already quietly snuck in. He was only a few steps away from their emperor. Given Fan Xian's strength, if he took a risk, he might actually be able to capture the Northern Qi emperor in the front room. The problem was, even if he could control the Northern Qi emperor, what problem could he solve? Furthermore, he had sensed long ago that there were countless aces hiding in the mountain courtyard. Outside this quiet and secluded room, there was a powerful figure slowly walking in. The footsteps stopped outside the room. Fan Xian lowered his head and furrowed his brows. He sensed carefully, but he still could not grasp the other person's breathing rhythm. From this detail, he was certain that the newcomer was an ace no less powerful than him. In terms of control of his inner strength, he was even purer and more natural than him. Other than the Northern Qi Emperor's martial teacher, Sir Lang Tiao, the head disciple of Tianyi Dao sect, who else could have such a realm? His grip on Sea Lily's hand unconsciously tightened. He suddenly felt that his situation was absurd. His plan today had been too impulsive. If the Northern Qi Emperor came to Dongyi in disguise, he would certainly have a terrifying defensive power at his side. How could everything go smoothly? Perhaps it was because he held the Northern Qi Emperor's weakness that he acted so crazily. If Lang Tiao walked into the room now, he would easily hear Sea Lily's breathing, and the eunuch's guess would fall through. He would then discover Fan Xian's presence. He turned his head and glanced at Sea Lily. His eyes were full of probing and questioning. How could Sea Lily not know what her enemy was thinking? Her eyes flickered, and she glared at him with extreme resentment. At this time, the Northern Qi Emperor was still resting outside. If he knew that his favored concubine and the most despicable pretty boy were not 10 steps away from him, exchanging amorous and passionate glances, He would probably be so angry that he would vomit blood and have green light glowing from the top of his head. Fan Xian smiled soundlessly. The corners of his lips pressed together slightly. His eyes blinked with a pleading expression. Sea Lily gazed helplessly at this man. Countless thoughts ran through her mind. Her fingers twisted nervously for a long time. Finally, she couldn't resist her heart softening. She agreed to the request in his eyes and faintly sighed. The Northern Qi Emperor's brows were tightly furrowed, thinking about something. Lang Qiao had just walked to the outside of the room to report something. The Northern Qi side all thought that Imperial concubine Li was playing in the garden, so the room should be quiet. Unexpectedly, a sigh suddenly rang out from inside the room. The tips of Fan Xian's brows twitched slightly. Outside, the Northern Qi Emperor's tightly furrowed brows suddenly relaxed. He opened his eyes and gazed calmly behind the curtains. Lang Qiao's figure stopped outside the room. His shadow was reflected in the door. Sea Lily tied her skirt as she walked out from behind the curtains. Flowing Cloud's hair was slightly messy, and her delicate face was slightly red. Her eyes, which seemed to speak, were slightly flustered as if she had just done something shameful. A cold light flashed through the Northern Qi Emperor's eyes. Coldly he said, "So you're here. Earlier, when the eunuch said you were in the garden, why didn't you make a sound?" Facing this emperor, Sea Lily was not as happy or afraid as she was facing Fan Xian. She smiled unusually naturally and then sat in front of the dressing table. Facing the large mirror, she once again tidied her makeup and hair. Casually she said, "Sometimes how could I make a sound?" Hiding behind the curtains, Fan Xian's heart thumped. He didn't know if he had taken the right risk or if Sea Lily was as he imagined. These words carried a double meaning and pricked at him until he felt numb. The Northern Qi Emperor laughed coldly and stood up. Walking behind Sea Lily, he said, "Did you do something shameful that you don't dare let me know?" Hearing these words, Fan Xian, who was hiding in the back, couldn't resist smiling bitterly. Unexpectedly, immediately after, Sea Lily turned her head and rolled her eyes at the Emperor. Very gently she said, "Who told you to come in like this?" "I was in the back. Of course it was shameful. Did you prepare for someone else to see me?" She left out at least 2 words in these words. Fan Xian looked at the gold-painted toilet beside him and immediately knew what Sea Lily was saying. Involuntarily, his heart trembled slightly. He thought to himself that this female spy indeed had some ability to remain calm in the face of chaos. The Northern Qi Emperor suddenly smiled. Looking at Sea Lily's beautiful face, his heart jumped. He leaned down and pecked her red lips. Vaguely he said, "I can't bear to let other people see the bright moon on your body." This kiss was extremely domineering. Their lips and teeth intertwined and sucked for a long time. It wasn't until Sea Lily was gasping for breath that the little emperor reluctantly spat out her tongue. A look of lust suddenly appeared on his handsome face. Watching this scene, Fan Xian's expression involuntarily became strange from behind the curtain. Fortunately, his state of mind was firm enough to control his breathing and heart rate and not let Lang Qiao, who was outside the room, notice. When he saw the Northern Qi Emperor reach his hand into Sea Lily's clothes and grab that soft ball and knead it endlessly, he finally couldn't help but change his expression. His eyes widened. He didn't want to miss this scene for even a moment. With great difficulty, this lively and fragrant scene came to an end. In particular, the strange interest contained in it was enough for Fan Xian to savor it. No one knew what Lang Qiao quietly said outside the room, but the lust on the Northern Qi Emperor's face disappeared. Bending his head, he muttered a few words beside Sea Lily's ear. His face was full of anger. He tidied up his messy clothes and walked out of the room. It was not until he confirmed the safety of the mountain residence did Fan Xian walk out in a flash. Staring at Sea Lily's beautiful red and tacky face, a strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. Sea Lily glared at him angrily and said, "What are you smiling about?" "I've seen a live erotic scene. Can I even smile?" Fan Xian sat down beside her. "Sir Fan Jr., what exactly are you doing here?" Sea Lily stared into his eyes and quietly said, "You're not here to see me and the Emperor being intimate, are you?" After these words were said, for some reason, a glimmer of shyness appeared on this Northern Qi Imperial consort's face. Fan Xian acutely noticed this. His heart jumped. Smiling slightly, he said, "I had wanted to discuss some things with the Emperor in private. I didn't think that Sir Lang Qiao would stay close to me and have the same interest in eavesdropping. It's impossible to talk to the Emperor in private. It looks like I'll have to wait until night." "Night?" Sea Lily paled in shock. "Are you going to wait in my room until night?" Fan Xian raised his brows. "Can't I?" You have to know that I've never seen such a beautiful intimate scene before. When I get back to the Qing Kingdom, I'll use Chao Shuichen's pen name and write a story about the Northern Qi Emperor's private matters. I'm sure it'll sell better than Story of the Stone. The Dambo bookstore will earn another large sum of money. I'll give you 20% as a tip. How about that? Sea Lily smiled coldly. Have you never been intimate with the princess before? Fan Xian finally couldn't help but laugh. Beaming with joy, he said, the problem is, this is the first time I've seen something like lace. What is lace? Sea Lily asked with confusion, her large eyes wide open. Fan Xian put away his smile and gazed calmly at her. Enunciating each word, he said, I've always been curious. How exactly do two women do that? Looking at His Majesty's expression earlier, it seemed that he was very interested in your body. Could it be that he was born with this taste? Sea Lily finally understood what he was saying. Her face suddenly became deathly pale. This was a great secret that the Northern Qi royal family had hidden for nearly 20 years. After Master Ku He's death, only a handful of people in the world knew about it. Suddenly hearing it from Fan Xian's mouth now, she couldn't help but be overwhelmed with shock. Is there an eternal secret in this world? Fan Xian sniffed and smelled the faint scent of gold osmanthus in the room. Looking at Sea Lily, he said quietly, especially for me. You three have taught me a lesson. Were you never afraid that I would guess this secret and use it to blackmail you? The shock in Sea Lily's heart could not be dispelled. She only stared at Fan Xian's face in disbelief. She didn't hear what he was saying at all. Seeing her terror and shock, Fan Xian comforted her in an even voice. What does this have to do with you? There is no need to be so scared. I'm just curious. Earlier Lang Tiao was outside the room. Why didn't you point out that I was in the room? Sea Lily was silent for a long time before she gradually digested the shock in her heart. Lowering her head and biting her lip, she said, The Emperor and I were both in the room. I know your methods. Sir Lang Tiao probably didn't even have time to enter the room before you killed us both. Fan Xian looked at her and shook his head. Seriously, he said, you know that is not the reason. No matter what, I have to thank you. Sea Lily suddenly raised her head and looked at Fan Xian. There is no need to thank me. I should be the one thanking you. Back then, on the road to the north, you saved my life. Later, you saved my brother's life. During these years, I have been in the Northern Qi Royal Palace. You have never tried to control me. No matter what, I cannot bear to see you be killed. Of course, she said with emphasis, I will also not allow you to harm the Emperor. You are wrong about one thing, Fan Xian said. You are only a noble consort. If I truly wanted to harm your Emperor, you would not be able to stop me. He suddenly shook his head and sighed. In the blink of an eye, 4 or 5 years have passed. I wonder how you are doing in Shangjing. Speaking of which, the relationship between Fan Xian and Sea Lily was incomparably complicated. It was impossible to explain it in a few words. However, what Sea Lily said earlier was correct. Fan Xian and Sea Lily had secretly reached an agreement to help her enter the palace. He had never tried to control her. Although no one in the world knows about the agreement between us, since you have helped me get revenge, I will do my best to help you. Sea Lily's expression suddenly became solemn. She stood and bowed to Fan Xian. It seemed that Fan Xian had always endlessly reached all kinds of agreements with different women. Yan Bingyun said that he relied on conquering women to conquer the world. It was not a mockery. It truly existed. That year, as the carriage traveled north, Fan Xian helped Sea Lily understand the poison Chen Pingping had buried in her body. At the same time, he promised her that if he had the opportunity, he would help her get revenge for her family. Sea Lily also agreed to become his spy in the Northern Qi royal palace. Sea Lily was a descendant of the Qing royal family. However, her grandfather had been tragically killed in the battle for the throne. Her parents had also died in the pursuit of the Qing court. Thus, she had grown up in Northern Qi's Shangjing. The important military official who had betrayed Sea Lily's grandfather and successfully helped the previous Qing emperor ascend to the throne was the old Qin master who had died to Fan Xian's hands 2 years ago. Regardless of what his motive was, Fan Xian had fulfilled his promise and helped Sea Lily get revenge. However, many years had passed. Sea Lily was far away in the Northern Qi palace. The Overwatch Council had no way of controlling her. Thus, Fan Xian was not sure if this woman still remembered the agreement from back then or if she would still help him. Fortunately, the scene in the room earlier had already confirmed that Sea Lily was willing to help Fan Xian, at least as long as she didn't harm the Northern Qi Emperor. Although Fan Xian was the man who understood a woman's thoughts the best in the world, in the end he came from Mars and women came from Venus. He didn't completely grasp Sea Lily's thoughts. Earlier, Sea Lily had helped him hide not only because she was grateful for his kindness in saving her life and the righteousness of revenge, but also because of some inexplicable emotions. This woman's background was strange. She had once used her identity as the top courtesan in Jingdo to hide and do spy work for Northern Qi. However, the only person who had truly had skin contact with her and could even be described as being in perfect harmony with her was Fan Xian. Particularly on that moonlit night in the broken temple, the fragrance of golden osmanthus on the large bed wafted into the nose. The relationship between a man and a woman was as complicated as their bodies. No one knew exactly what had happened. The path to a woman's heart was sex? Who said that? However, it seemed to make some sense. At least, Sea Lily's gaze as she looked at Fan Xian was so complicated that it made one's hair stand on end. Fan Xian was finally defeated by Sea Lily's faint gaze. How could he forget the pleasure boat by the Lujing River, the carriage by the North Sea, the broken temple, the Li Pavilion, and this woman? He had always thought that this woman was different from all the other women in the world. She had great control over her future, so he had unconsciously kept his distance. However, this faint gaze made him finally understand that no matter how powerful a woman was, in the end, a woman. In the Northern Qi royal palace, there was not a single real man. How could Sea Lily endure that kind of loneliness? She didn't know how many times she had thought of Fan Xian's enchanting fingertips and that gentle yet chilling face. She had thought about it in a daze for many years, and it had become a mental barrier. Fan Xian was silent and speechless. He gently held Sea Lily's hand and looked into her eyes that could speak. He smiled slightly. Sea Lily suddenly remembered something and smiled bitterly. The Emperor treats me very well. I would like to ask you for a favor. He wants to kill me. He's thought about it many times. Fan Xian gazed at Sea Lily and said calmly, I am a vengeful person, particularly since his plan for coming to Dongyi is too big. I cannot give it to them with both hands. Regardless of how the Qing royal family treated your family in the past, you are, after all, a Qing person. You cannot just watch as the two sides join hands and put pressure on the Qing kingdom. After my parents died, I no longer see myself as a Qing person. Sea Lily slowly pulled her hand back from his and said, I am just a normal and pitiful woman. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said seriously, that's right. If I ask for your help in this matter, it would indeed be unreasonable. I just want to know how his discussion with Sigu Jian in the sword hut these 2 days went. The corners of Sea Lily's lips twitched slightly. She smiled. Perhaps you won't believe it if I say it, but Sigu Jian is so arrogant that the Emperor personally deigned to come and enter the sword hut for 2 days straight. Yet he didn't even see this great grandmaster's face. Fan Xian's brows twitched. He felt a great shock in his heart. He wondered to himself what had happened to Sigu Jian. The Northern Qi Emperor had come personally, yet he still refused to see him. Even if Sigu Jian had used 13th Wang to express a portion of his attitude, the Northern Qi Emperor's arrival was clearly a weapon he could use to bargain. In a corner of the mountain courtyard, aces from Northern Qi and the sword hut were hidden everywhere. Among the flowers, the Northern Qi Emperor, who had been invited out by Lang Tiao, looked at the grass hut below the mountain gate with a wooden expression. The corners of his eyes twitched slightly. It was as if he felt boundless anger at Sigu Jian for refusing to see him. 13th Wang wants to charge into the sword hut. It is clear that he wants to bring a message to Sigu Jian for the Qing kingdom's Fan Xian, Lang Tiao said calmly to the side. At this moment, Yunjilan's people are still blocking him outside. Although the disciples of the sword hut lean toward our court, they cannot kill 13th Wang in broad daylight. In my opinion, that person is Fan Xian, the Northern Qi Emperor said quietly as he closed his eyes. Lang Tiao's brows furrowed slightly. He knew how difficult it was to provoke the Qing kingdom's Fan Xian. If the commander of the brocade guard, Wei Hua, had not been able to delay the Qing diplomatic group and allowed Fan Xian to arrive in Dongyi ahead of time, he probably had the power to destroy the emperor's plan. Sigu Jian's attitude is too warm and unclear. I still cannot guess what he is thinking. The Northern Qi Emperor suddenly opened his eyes. Coldness surged through them. There will be a major battle between our court and the Qing kingdom. Once Fan Xian dies, the Qing Emperor will certainly send out troops in a rage. Dongyi will have no choice but to lean toward our court. Once the battle starts, how will we clean it up? Lang Qiao furrowed his brows. Even if Fan Xian dies in Dongyi, the Qing Emperor will certainly put this on our heads. What can Fan Xian do if he doesn't die? The Northern Qi Emperor's gaze suddenly became perplexed. Can he stop the battle from happening? My Qi kingdom is not ready and should not provoke the Qing kingdom. If I don't move, then Dongyi will certainly be swallowed up by the Qing kingdom. At that time, my Qi kingdom will be even weaker and will never be able to turn things around. Although young, the Northern Qi emperor, who had meticulously planned everything, coldly said, I had once placed my hopes on Fan Xian. Later on I thought about it carefully. Those not of my race must have different intentions. In the end, he is the Qing emperor's illegitimate child. How could he think for the Qi kingdom? Particularly these few years, I have watched him closely and disregarded what he was thinking in Dingzhou. At the very least, I am certain of one thing. He is still far from being a match for the Qing emperor. It is impossible for him to affect the Qing emperor's ambitions. Lang Qiao fell silent. As the present head of Tianyi Dao, he was well aware of the Dingzhou and Qingzhou matters. Many Qing mountain disciples had died at the hands of Fan Xian's Overwatch Council. A moment later, he quietly said, I wonder what Duo will think. A glimmer of confusion flashed through the little emperor's eyes. If Aunt Disciple was in my position, she would probably also kill Fan Xian. The eunuch with the slightly sharp voice took small steps and hurried to their side. Lowering his voice, he reported, I have already sent an edict to Imperial Consort C, ordering her to come to the garden. The room is already empty. Friar He and the aces of the Sword Hut have already hidden their positions and are ready to act at any time, the eunuch reported in a trembling voice. Entering the room to deliver the edict to see Lily must have frightened him quite a bit. Lang Qiao closed his eyes. When he opened them, they shone brightly and were immediately restrained. Slowly he said, I'm going. The Northern Qi emperor nodded slightly. He knew that if the person in the room was really Fan Xian, if Lang Qiao didn't personally act, Friar He and the warriors of the Sword Hut would not be able to keep him here. Lang Qiao walked toward the room. The Northern Qi emperor stood by the door of the mountain residence. Looking at the grass hut, he narrowed his eyes slightly. Countless complicated emotions flashed through his eyes. As an emperor, there were always many things he had no choice but to do. Even if he had to be ruthless, he often had to be ruthless to himself. See Lily, led by the eunuch, came behind him. She glanced at the emperor's figure with a glimmer of confusion. The Northern Qi emperor slowly turned around and looked at the woman he liked the most with a slight smile. He thought to himself that if it weren't for See Lily's slightly tart tongue and the shyness of not seeing each other for a long time in the quiet room, he probably wouldn't have guessed that the brat would be so daring as to sneak into the mountain residence. I kept forgetting to howl. There was also a typo, so I howled while I was changing it. The last few chapters have been so hard to write. It will be even harder tomorrow. Chapter 631. Yesterday when I was correcting a typo, I wailed loudly. My 2,000 subscribed friends didn't see it. In reality, I was just sighing at the headache of writing. P.S. Today is the 10th. Greetings to everyone for monthly votes. Those who are happy, please throw me a few votes. Also, I will write an extra chapter in the next few days, but it is definitely not to explode for votes. There won't be too many words in a chapter. It is just to make up for the chapter one didn't write when I drank too much that day. I'm a lazy person. From the emperor's cold and mocking gaze, See Lily understood many things. Her heart immediately grew cold. Slowly lowering her head, she bit her plump lower lip and didn't say a word. The Northern Qi emperor looked at her appearance. For some reason, a wave of anger surged in his heart. Through his teeth, he said in an icy voice, "Is this how you repay me?" The last 3 words rose in pitch. The eunuchs were all outside the little garden while the aces of the Sword Hut and Northern Qi had already surrounded the room. The Northern Qi emperor was not worried that Fan Xian would be able to get close to his body. See Lily raised her head and calmly replied, "Lily has not done anything wrong to you, your majesty." The Northern Qi emperor's expression gradually became dark and cold. Pointing at her face, he said each word clearly, "What else do you want to do wrong to me? Do you want him to kill me for it to be right?" Without waiting for See Lily to reply, he narrowed his eyes and said, "It's a pity that he is about to die." Hearing these words, See Lily had long shaken off her earlier shock. She knew what kind of person Fan Xian was. Even though Sir Lang Qiao had brought a group of aces from the Sword Hut to subdue Fan Xian, he knew too many things. She looked at the Northern Qi emperor with pity and quietly said, "Your Majesty, if I were you, I would let Fan Xian leave and capture him or try to kill him. Who knows what earth-shattering things he will do before he dies." The Northern Qi emperor was slightly startled. He didn't understand what See Lily meant by her words. A gust of wind suddenly blew through the little garden in the mountain residence. Amidst the swirling sand, a black and red figure came crashing down like a boulder in the wind. Its power was unstoppable as it ruthlessly smashed toward the emperor's slightly thin and weak body. The little emperor's pupils constricted. In that instant he clearly saw who this person was. He was endlessly shocked. Could it be that even with his clever arrangements and the combined attack of Master Lang Tiao, Friar He, and the warriors of the Sword Hut had not been able to stop this person? In the blink of an eye he was, after all, an emperor. Facing such a dangerous situation, he did not panic at all. With a roar, he drew his sword from his waist and slashed at the figure. With a clang, the knife and sword clashed. The black dagger easily broke through the Northern Qi Emperor's sword. The figure moved closer to the Northern Qi Emperor's embrace. Like a gust of wind entering the embrace of the forest, like a stone falling into the clear lake. It startled a group of pine trees and created layers of clear ripples. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of fresh blood onto the little emperor's body, drenching him with blood. Although the black dagger had easily broken through the emperor's sword, this gentle touch caused him, at the end of his strength, to suffer great damage to his heart meridians. He sprayed out a sky full of blood. To be able to escape from the encirclement of 5 9th-level aces was not because Fan Xian had exceptional abilities. Rather, it was because when the eunuch had gone to summon Sea Lily to see the emperor, Fan Xian had seen a problem. Although he wasn't sure how the Northern Qi Emperor had guessed that there was someone in the room, he didn't have much time to think. Just as Sea Lily had taken 2 steps away from the mountain residence, he had broken out of the encirclement and forcefully pushed aside Friar He's sinister attack and avoided the sword light and chill of the Sword Hut disciples. He had only been a moment ahead, but it was the most critical moment. On his escape route he had run into Lang Tiao. If Lang Tiao had attacked outside the room, Fan Xian probably would not have had any chance to escape. Under the eaves he had exchanged a blow with Lang Tiao. Fan Xian's body flew up diagonally. Lang Tiao's Jinqi had also been stimulated. His legs sank and he could not move for a moment. At that time there were 2 paths in front of Fan Xian. One was up the mountain and the other was toward the grass hut. Without question the second path was more dangerous. Yun Jilan and the 2 disciples of the Sword Hut were still standing guard at the foot of the mountain. Once he fell into such a hopeless situation, even if Fan Xian had exceptional abilities, it would be difficult for him to survive. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian turned sharply in the air like a sparrow hawk. Drawing an arc, he charged straight toward the precipice of the mountain residence. Below the precipice was one of the holy lands of martial arts, the Sword Hut. Fan Xian had made such a risky choice because he was not satisfied. He was not satisfied that he had taken such a great risk and hadn't even seen Sigu Jian's face. He hadn't even touched the Northern Qi Emperor's side. The heavens were indeed looking out for him. On his escape route, he ran into the little garden and saw the emperor dressed as a young master standing by the mountain gate. Fresh blood sprayed over the Northern Qi Emperor's head and face like it was free of charge. Fan Xian closed in on his body but was unable to stop his footsteps. He had forcefully escaped danger and had exchanged a blow with Lang Tiao along the way. He had truly reached his limit. It was impossible for him to pull back his feet. Under Sea Lily's terrified gaze, Fan Xian held the little emperor like 2 men committing suicide for love. Resolutely and courageously they fell down the precipice. A few streaks of light flashed past. With Lang Tiao in the lead, a number of aces passed by Sea Lily's side. With faces full of shock, they watched as Fan Xian held the little emperor and charged down the precipice with no regard for his life. Without even thinking they followed him down. Fan Xian was not committing suicide. In this world, other than Uncle Wuzhu, he was the only one who had turned jumping off cliffs into entertainment. Although he was heavily injured and held an important person in his arms, he still accurately found a foothold. Whether it was a protruding rock or a sunken hole in the grass, he was like a wooden man with springs installed. He kicked up a trail of dust on the precipitous precipice. In an instant he had landed on the flat ground below the precipice. The speed of his fall was very fast. The rebound was great. A trickle of blood seeped out of the corner of Fan Xian's lips again. The Northern Qi Emperor, who had been forcefully restrained by him, was shaken to the core. His face was pale. Even so, there was still not a glimmer of fear in the Emperor's eyes. He only stared coldly into Fan Xian's eyes with slight confusion. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would not only be able to escape but also restrain him. The flat ground below the precipice was in front of the Sword Hut. A strange change occurred. The disciples of the sword hut, who had been forcefully preventing 13th Wang from entering the sword hut, drew their swords from their waists and quickly formed a sword formation, surrounding Fan Xian in the center. Not far away, Yun Jilan, who had been hiding in the dark and had not shown himself, finally walked out. Sword intent shot into the sky and pierced toward Fan Xian. A number of gray shadows flashed past the precipice. With Lang Qiao in the lead, the aces were only a moment slower than Fan Xian. They stepped onto the rocks and followed. The scene immediately sank into silence. The silence contained boundless nervousness. Fan Xian held the Northern Qi Emperor's pulse with one hand and gripped the black dagger tightly with the other. His eyes watched his surroundings cautiously. He only needed a faint glance to know that all of the 9th-level aces in the world, particularly those from Northern Qi and Dongyi, had basically gathered here. Ever since the Battle of Dong Mountain, probably only the Sword Hut could gather so many powerful warriors. These people's goal was the same. It was simple, to keep Fan Xian here. The problem was that Fan Xian held the Northern Qi Emperor's hand in his hand. Although his grip was gentle, everyone knew that if he wanted to, the strange tyrannical Jinqi in his body could immediately turn the Northern Qi Emperor into countless balls of flesh and blood. To be able to suppress the Emperor while surrounded by so many aces, he is indeed worthy of being the Qin Kingdom's Fan Xian. Someone looked at this scene and sighed in admiration in a quiet voice. The person who spoke was the second disciple of the Sword Hut. At this moment, everyone was in a nervous mood. Only this second disciple, who did not belong to either side, could so naturally sigh and say what everyone wanted to say in their hearts. Although everyone in the world knew that Commissioner Fan was already a top 9th-level ace, it was clearly the Northern Qi Emperor who had grasped his tracks and arranged an ambush in the mountain residence. Unexpectedly, he had escaped and held the Emperor hostage. Regardless of whether it was Friar He or the aces of the Sword Hut, in a one-on-one situation, even if they were no match for Fan Xian, they could at least bring him a great deal of trouble. Furthermore, in the mountain residence, there was still Sir Lang Tiao, whose strength was not below Fan Xian's. Even in such a situation, they were still unable to keep Fan Xian. Everyone present felt a chill in their hearts. They wondered if Fan Xian had had some strange encounter these 2 years to become so powerful. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and coughed. Holding the little emperor's hand tightly, he looked around and said in a raspy voice, "So, everyone is here. Can we talk properly now?" The sword hut was on the outskirts of Dongyi. The concave grass hut stood against the mountain and took up a large amount of space. The door to the grass hut was at the bottom of the cliff. Sigu Jian and the other disciples were in seclusion in the depths of the grass hut. At this moment, a dozen aces had gathered in front of the sword hut. They should not have disturbed the important figures in the depths of the sword hut. Fan Xian knew he was not powerful. One powerful Lang Qiao was enough to hold him back. Furthermore, outside the crowd, Yun Jilan was gradually gathering sword intent as he stared at him. These two were both top 9th-level aces who had been famous for a long time. The reason he had been able to escape from the mountain residence earlier was completely because of his wild beast sense of danger and valiant decisiveness. As for capturing the Northern Qi Emperor in the end, it was all thanks to his luck. If he had not surprised everyone by charging valiantly toward the sword hut at the bottom of the cliff, he would not have encountered the Northern Qi Emperor. The key to success was power, decisiveness, luck, and the courage that Fan Xian had lacked the most in the past. Although he had already subdued the Northern Qi Emperor, the situation was still dangerous. Regardless of who it was, no one would be able to escape the encirclement of these aces. Success? It was still too early. He had only just started on his way. What he was on was a dangerous path filled with brambles and small blood-soaked flowers. The Northern Qi Emperor stood by his side and looked coldly at the man beside him. Even in such a dangerous situation, his expression did not change. He couldn't help but feel some admiration. Slowly he said, "Fan Xian, you are very daring to offend me in front of the sword hut." Fan Xian raised his wrist and wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips. Self-mockingly he said, "Your Majesty wants to kill me. Do I have to stretch out my neck and wait to be executed?" He raised his head, squinted at his surroundings and said, "Although I don't want to do something as unskilled as kidnapping, you actually found me so quickly, and your luck is bad enough to be caught by me, so I can only be a kidnapper." He raised his voice and smiled slightly at the gradually approaching crowd. "To put it crudely, if you want him to live, don't force me. Don't force me to act out." After these words were said, everyone fell silent. Yun Jilan slowly separated the group and raised his hands in a greeting toward Fan Xian. In a quiet voice he said, Sir Fan Jr., you alone have caused trouble for the Sword Hut. I Yunjilan cannot help but admire you. However, even if you have subdued the Emperor, this place is still the Sword Hut. Do you expect me to let you leave? At this moment, Lang Tiao also walked forward and bowed to Fan Xian. Sir Fan Jr., I admire your courage and strength. However, with so many heroes gathered here, even if you have extraordinary abilities, you will not be able to escape unscathed. As for the Emperor, of course we cannot let you take him away. Fan Xian forcefully swallowed the blood surging up. Raising his brows, his expression became fierce. I can't beat you. If you are not willing to let me go, I don't mind having someone go with me. Remember to arrange a grave together. I want to leave a glorious mark in history. Encountering such a seemingly unreasonable, rude and shameless warrior who was actually sinister to the extreme and who no one knew what he had up his sleeves, Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan both felt troubled. Yun Jilan glanced at Lang Tiao. He seemed to be confused. Since they had discovered Fan Xian's existence in the mountain residence, given his cultivation and the help of a few aces, how could he still escape and even capture the Qi Emperor as a hostage? Lang Tiao's heart was filled with sadness and anger. How could he have thought that Fan Xian, surrounded and attacked by so many people, would walk right into the trap and run toward the Sword Hut? Who would have thought that at that time, the Emperor would be watching the Sword Hut in a daze? The Sword Hut was shocked by the power Fan Xian had displayed. They couldn't help but feel eager. They wanted to see just what the limits of the leading young aces of the Qin kingdom were. However, the northern Qi aces were terrified. They were terrified that if Fan Xian was careless or his mood suddenly turned bad, he would hurt the Emperor. Just as the situation reached an impasse, the northern Qi Emperor, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly said, Fan Xian, don't scare these pitiful people. You wouldn't dare to touch a finger of mine. Fan Xian turned his head and saw the little emperor looking at him with a mocking gaze. For some reason he was angered by this gaze. Smiling mockingly, he stretched out 2 fingers and lifted the little emperor's chin. Disdainfully he said, Little thing, your chin is pretty slippery. The entire scene burst into an uproar. No one had thought that Fan Xian would do such a frivolous thing to the ruler of a country. Then they heard Fan Xian's next words and said, I wouldn't dare to touch a finger of yours. How about 2? I swear on my teacher's name that if you let the Emperor go, we will not stop you, Lang Tiao suddenly said in a cold voice as he took a step forward. Wind rose from nowhere and his aura exploded. Given his position, this oath was, without a doubt, giving Fan Xian an excellent opportunity to retreat. However, Fan Xian did not want to retreat at all. Other than Fan Xian, no one else dared to be so daring to not retreat in the face of the threat of so many aces. Instead, he wanted to seek more benefits. If you don't stop me, what about the people of the Sword Hut? Fan Xian asked as he looked at Lang Tiao. Lang Tiao glanced at Yun Jilan. Yun Jilan closed his eyes for a moment and then quietly said, The disciples of the Sword Hut will not stop you. However, once you walk half a li out of the Sword Hut, they will begin to chase after you. Fan Xian looked at him and smiled mockingly. Turning his head, he said to Lang Tiao, You heard it. I don't want to be chased after. Lang Tiao angrily said, Then what exactly do you want to do? Fan Xian was silent for a moment. His gaze suddenly turned to the continuous grass hut not far away. His gaze gradually lowered and swept across 13th Wang, who seemed to have been forgotten by everyone. Calmly he said, I am a bit tired. I want to sit for a while. Once the agreement is reached, I will let him go. Within half a li you cannot stop me. Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan nodded at the same time. Regardless of which side it was, their hearts were burning like wildfire. They were terrified that Fan Xian would do anything unfavorable to the Northern Qi Emperor. Fan Xian slowly let go of the Northern Qi Emperor's hand. The little emperor did not immediately retreat. Instead, he looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes as if he wanted to see some secret in them. The Northern Qi Emperor suddenly smiled helplessly and said, You are very daring. Fan Xian also smiled helplessly. I would never have thought that you would be able to guess everything I am thinking. I know you won't let me go. The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him coldly. I'm just curious. If this stalemate continues, you are already injured and your strength is gradually weakening. How will you be able to defend against a surprise attack from a few aces? Of course I can't bear to let you go. Furthermore, I am indeed tired. There was no expression on Fan Xian's face. I want to find a place to sit. The 2 of them did not speak loudly. The Northern Qi Emperor knew that even if he exposed Fan Xian's intentions in front of his officials, It would be difficult to change all of this unless he guessed what Fan Xian was preparing to do next. Take a seat? In such a dangerous situation, where could Fan Xian go to sit and not worry about being hunted down by these aces? The Northern Qi Emperor's gaze suddenly landed on a New Year's painting hanging on the wall of the grass hut. His heart jumped. His eyes lit up. His thin lips opened slightly as he prepared to speak. However, Fan Xian did not give him another chance. Taking advantage of the moment the encirclement retreated, his expression darkened. His left hand stretched out like a snake. His fingertips pinched the Northern Qi Emperor's hand between his thumb and index finger. Twisting his thumb, he used a little trick to make a wave of pain in his right arm so that he could no longer summon it. In the instant that Fan Xian stretched out his hand like lightning, 13th Wang, who had been standing silently on the outskirts under a willow tree, slammed his palm into the willow tree. His face suddenly became deathly pale. His body began to tremble violently. The poison in 13th Wang's body had not been purged. His strength was not as good as usual, but the Jinqi in his body was still abundant. Particularly now that he had unleashed his full power, coupled with his usual indomitable aura, he immediately caused a ripple in the scene. His body trembled more and more violently. The willow tree under his palm also trembled more and more violently. After 3 breaths, with a crisp crack, the lower part of the willow tree snapped. 13th Wang let out an explosive cry. Holding the willow tree upside down with both hands, he used the tree as a sword. Gathering all of his cultivation into his hands, he demonstrated the most powerful attack of the Sigu sword. The tree trunk as a sword, the branches as a blade, and the leaves as the tip, sweeping away an army. Countless muffled groans rang out in the field and smoke and dust rose. It was unknown how many experts reacted in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. They either dodged or slashed at the willow tree that seemed to have flown out of the sky, displaying their ultimate skills. They knew that when faced with such a willow tree that contained an aura and power, if they didn't use their full strength, they would probably end up with broken bones and shattered tendons if they took the slightest hit. The encirclement around the sword hut immediately fell into chaos. However, there were 2 people who did not panic. Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan had not been confused by this willow tree that could sweep away an army. The 2 aces stared coldly at Fan Xian's every move. Suddenly they turned into 2 black shadows and attacked Fan Xian from both sides. In the instant that 13th Wang broke through the willow tree and struck, Fan Xian had already finished adjusting his breathing and regained control of the Northern Qi Emperor. With a muffled grunt, he raised his body and leaped into the air. When Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan came behind him, 13th Wang's willow tree also smashed toward Fan Xian's body. Fan Xian stood on his tiptoes in the air and beautifully raised his body by another half. The tip of his foot gently stepped on the top of the willow tree. With a puff, a leaf shattered into strands. A branch was soft and bouncy, but it seemed to have boundless rebounding power. It shook Fan Xian's body until it turned into a streak of light and headed toward the main door of the sword hut. Charged toward it. Lang Qiao's hand stretched out hurriedly. With a hiss, he tore off half of Fan Xian's clothes. The curved knives tied to his wrists flew through the air and slashed viciously, but they also missed. Yun Jilan made a smooth turn in the air. The sword at his waist flowed out like water and slashed toward Fan Xian's completely exposed back. It only barely managed to cut open Fan Xian's right shoulder and draw out a trickle of blood. The willow tree 13th Wang held was too long and too big. The speed of the tree tip was too fast. It was so fast that it was as if it had sent Fan Xian flying. It was faster than the long-hidden attacks of Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan. With a crisp crack, the grass door of the sword hut was smashed to pieces by Fan Xian. He grabbed the Northern Qi Emperor and charged forward like a gust of wind. Chapter 632. I had worked so hard to write 6,666 words in the last chapter, but it was 6,660. Speechless. P.S. I want a monthly vote. When 13th Wang's palm cut through the willow tree and Fan Xian turned into a butterfly, Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan did not even look at each other. They could feel the regret and fear in each other's hearts. Only now did they understand why Fan Xian had not thought about retreating after being discovered in the mountain residence. Instead, he had fled toward the sword hut. That was why he had coincidentally subdued the Northern Qi Emperor. From the beginning, Fan Xian's goal had been the sword hut. He had come today to enter the sword hut and see Sigu Jian. In midair, Lang Qiao let out a wild howl. The metal chains on his wrists clanked. The 2 curved knives sliced toward Fan Xian's back like 2 pieces of golden light. He knew that he could not allow Fan Xian to take the emperor hostage and enter the depths of the sword hut. Once he left his sight, no one knew what kind of terrifying conclusion Northern Qi would meet. Furthermore, he believed the emperor who was subdued by Fan Xian. Although the emperor was young, his experiences these years had proven that he had insight and wisdom that far exceeded that of mortals. Since the emperor calculated that Fan Xian would not harm him, then Lang Qiao was going to bet on this. He was going to attack where Fan Xian had to save him and force him to withdraw his hand. The two pieces of golden light sliced toward Fan Xian's opening. The long sword in Yun Jilan's hand was incomparably quiet. It calmly and evenly passed through the gap between the two pieces of golden light and pierced toward the back of Fan Xian's neck. The sword light spat out like a silver snake spitting out its tongue. The sword intent was swift and fierce. The sword intent of this strike was actually very similar to the sword intent 13th Wang had used earlier with the willow in his arms. They were both Sigu Jian's most focused attacks that only cared about the front and not the back. Yun Jilan's reason for taking the risk to attack was different from Lang Qiao's. He cared about the Northern Qi Emperor's life and death, but he didn't believe in the Northern Qi Emperor's judgment. However, he had a great reason not to let Fan Xian enter the sword hut because his teacher was inside. Due to different reasons, the two superior 9th-level aces made the same decision. At the same time, they used their trump cards. Regardless of the cost and even risking the risk of Fan Xian killing the Northern Qi Emperor, they sliced toward the large opening behind Fan Xian. At this time, the four people in the air were like birds flying above a stone plain in the front yard of the sword hut. Time seemed to have stopped at this moment. Fan Xian held the Northern Qi Emperor in his hand. Although his right hand held the black dagger, he was unable to stop the chill from behind him. Behind him, Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan floated in midair. Their swords and sabers sliced through the air soundlessly, but their auras interfered with each other, giving off a chilling creaking sound. At this moment, if Fan Xian did not abandon her and turn back to save himself, only death awaited him. If he turned around to save himself, he would probably be heavily injured. Furthermore, the Northern Qi Emperor would certainly break free of his control. So, Fan Xian chose to do nothing. He continued to follow his fixed flight path and rushed toward the second door of the grass hut, completely ignoring the curved knife and straight sword behind him. He had left Jingdo, come to Dongyi, entered the mountain residence and charged straight into the sword hut. It was all based on one judgment and one confidence. He did not believe that after the other party had shown so much sincerity, they would just watch as all this happened. This matter had nothing to do with luck. It was completely based on Fan Xian's judgment of the situation in the world, his insight into people's hearts, and his confidence in that strange old creature. Things happened as he wished. When the knives and swords were still half a foot from his back, the door 3 feet in front of him creaked open. The second door of the sword hut opened wide in front of the fleeing Fan Xian, welcoming his arrival. Fan Xian carried the Northern Qi Emperor and threw himself in. Then the door closed with a bang, firmly shutting Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan outside, as well as the two curved knives and the long sword outside. The door of the grass hut was often only a symbolic separation. It was mostly made of hay and wood. Such a weak door had, in that instant, blocked between Fan Xian and the two aces behind him. How could such a door stop the red-eyed Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan? The scene outside the sword hut was in chaos. A dozen streaks of flowing light scattered, avoiding the willow tree. 13th Wang had abandoned the willow tree and stood alone. No one paid attention to him. They only turned their nervous gazes toward the door of the sword hut. They all clearly saw Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan, these two powerful warriors, chasing Fan Xian into the grass hut. However, after a moment, everyone was shocked speechless by the scene that followed. With two muffled grunts, two figures flew back wretchedly. It was Lang Qiao and Yun Jilan. When they had charged into the sword hut, they had been imposing. Now they had retreated at an even faster speed. Their situation was wretched. Lang Qiao somersaulted a few times in the air. The power in his body rose to the limit. His two curved knives protected his body like rain. A golden light enveloped the area in front of him. No one knew what invisible power he was resisting. On the other hand, Yun Jilan lowered his head and restrained his breathing. One knee was raised slightly, and the other was extended horizontally behind him. His sword was held horizontally to his brow. He was very respectful and didn't dare to use his qi. He only used the pure Jinqi in his body to barely resist. He retreated quickly, not daring to stop at all. Lang Qiao spun faster and faster in the air. His two knives also sped faster and faster. In the end, they became two streaks of flowing light. With a loud cry, his two knives chopped down. After a muffled thud, his body stopped. A tree branch was cut in half by him and fell weakly to the ground. Lang Qiao pushed back with one foot and raised his brows. He forced himself not to retreat, but his chest felt heavy. In the end, the boundless killing intent contained in the tree branch had shattered his meridians. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Yun Jilan retreated even faster than Lang Qiao, more completely and more respectfully. He had no intention of using the sword in his hand to resist anything. He was forced back 150 feet. He then knelt on one knee on the ground and raised his sword with trembling hands. A verdant leaf was attached to the blade of his sword. Everyone present was shocked. They watched as these two warriors were about to capture Fan Xian. Who would have thought that the person in the sword hut would only use a branch and a leaf to force these two warriors back? There were only a few people in this world who had such an unfathomable realm. The master of the sword hut was clearly one of them. It looked like the ruckus outside the sword hut had finally startled the ruthless sword saint. Sigurjian had chopped off a branch and picked up a leaf to force back the two 9th level aces at the very top of the human world. The realm of a great grandmaster was indeed far beyond the mortal realm. However, in the end this great grandmaster was still biased. So, he had thrown a leaf at his eldest disciple and a branch at Lang Qiao. When he saw the green leaf fly out of the second door, Yun Jilan could only retreat in fear. Lang Qiao, on the other hand, was filled with an endless desire to fight. He forcefully took on the branch. That was why Lang Qiao was injured and vomited blood. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, this was what happened. Sigurjian, who had been silent for almost 3 years and had hidden in the sword hut and not seen visitors for 3 years, finally made his move. It would have been fine if he hadn't made his move. Once he did, it was world-shaking and shocked the surroundings. Outside the grass door, all of the disciples of the sword hut knelt on the ground in unison and kowtowed in the direction of the sword hut. The disciples who had participated in the matter of controlling 13th Wang felt fear and a powerful sense of unease. Unconsciously, they began to search with their gazes for their eldest disciple brother's figure. Just like what was written in many novels, among the groups that were best at taking the blame, the eldest disciple brother would definitely take the most blame, such as the monkey. Yun Jilan half knelt on the ground. His expression was calm, but the sleeve on his forearm trembled gently like it had been blown by the wind, revealing the true emotions in the depths of his heart. He didn't know when his teacher had come to the front of the sword hut. He also didn't know what his teacher thought of his actions. He only knew that he had to do this, even if his teacher did not allow it. Friar, he supported the injured Lang Qiao. The northern Qi aces looked in shock at the tightly closed door of the sword hut. They didn't know what was happening inside or what was about to happen. Why would Sigurjian help Fan Xian hold the emperor hostage? Was the emperor still safe? Their hearts were burning with anxiety. Under Sigurjian's might, they did not dare charge in to save him. Even the most powerful of them, Sir Lang Qiao, could not defeat a branch casually thrown by Sigurjian. This kind of difference in power could not be made up for with determination and courage. Lang Qiao slowly wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and looked coldly into the depths of the sword hut. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. It was as if he felt that some things were beyond his expectations. Landing heavily on the hard stone ground, the tip of Fan Xian's foot pulled back in the moment of impact. Using the momentum, he bounced up. His palm had long let go of the little emperor's hand. Raising it, he held the black dagger upside down in his right hand. Half crouching on the ground, he stared at the wooden door behind him. In such a short amount of time, he had forcefully changed his position, prepared his killing move, and assumed the posture of a tiger fighting a rabbit. It had to be said that Fan Xian's present strength was indeed valiant. If Yun Jilan and Lang Qiao had broken in at this moment, at least Fan Xian would not be as wretched as he was earlier. On the contrary, he would have been able to give them a lightning-fast attack. It was just that after a long time, that seemingly fragile grass door was still quietly closed. No one broke through the door, and even the sound outside the door gradually became weaker. This overly ordinary grass door seemed to be able to shut out all the wind, rain, and blood outside. It allowed the people inside to form their own unity and live peacefully in the sword hut, seeking their own happiness in seclusion. After a long time, Fan Xian slowly rose and looked at the door with narrowed eyes. He knew that since Yun Jilan and Lang Qiao had not charged in earlier, they would not have the courage to make a second attempt, at least in a short period of time. Without even thinking, he knew why. Although the sword hut was a martial holy land for Yun Jilan, the only person who could drive him out was the master of the sword hut, that strange and ruthless great grandmaster. Fan Xian was not surprised. The reason he had chosen to forcefully break into the sword hut earlier was because he had guessed that Sigurjian would not just watch as he was taken advantage of. He was only curious as to what method Sigurjian had used to express his attitude. It was completely silent inside the sword hut. Fan Xian turned around and found that the little northern Qi emperor was half sitting on the stone floor, holding his foot. It seemed that the collision earlier had injured him. Fan Xian was not in the mood to pay attention to him. He only calmly looked around. However, he did not see any trace of anyone. He did not see that branch or leaf. In the instant before he turned around, he faintly caught a familiar figure out of the corner of his eye. It was this figure that made him feel strange. Coming to the sword hut today, he did not bring the shadow. Who was that figure? If it was Sigurjian, why did he feel it was familiar? On the stone floor, bits of grass slowly moved with the wind. The clamor outside the sword hut seemed to be a story from many years ago. Fan Xian walked to the northern Qi emperor's side and stretched out a hand to help him up. He then walked toward the third door in the sword hut. Just as the two of them were less than 3 steps away from the door, it was slowly pulled open from the inside. A child stuck out his head. His lively eyes moved endlessly, sweeping a few times between Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor. With a chuckle he said, "Which of you is surnamed Fan? Which is surnamed Zhan?" "I am the northern Qi emperor." The northern Qi emperor's face was deathly white. It looked like the injury to his ankle made him unable to endure the pain. Inside the sword hut, he still habitually opened his mouth to speak first. Fan Xian felt very strange. He didn't know what he would encounter in the sword hut. With a slightly mocking smile, he said, "Then I can only be surnamed Fan." Hearing the two of them announce their surnames, the child smiled happily and pulled the grass door completely open. Bowing respectfully, he said, "Please follow me. The room is still inside." The child turned to lead the way. In Fan Xian's arms, the northern Qi emperor furrowed his brows. He had been in Dongyi for a number of days and had entered the sword hut many times. He was not unfamiliar with the roads, but he had never seen Sigurjian in person. Fan Xian had broken through his and Yun Jilan's obstruction and forcefully entered the sword hut. It looked like Sigurjian was not angry. On the contrary, he had the intention of meeting the two of them. Thinking of this, the northern Qi emperor's state of mind became serious. He faintly sensed that something was wrong. Fan Xian's gaze was focused behind the child. The child carried a long sword on his back. It looked completely at odds with his thin figure. Before long, the child brought the two of them to a room deep in the sword hut. A servant woman brought in hot water and food before retreating, leaving the quiet room for Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor. The host had not said anything to meet them, so the two guests could only passively accept the arrangements. Deep in the sword hut, the room was unusually quiet. Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor were alone in the quiet room. The atmosphere immediately became strange. Fan Xian walked to the window and pushed it open to look out. With a glance, he saw the large pit in the middle of the courtyard. His pupils constricted slightly. The northern Qi emperor sat on the side of the bed behind him and stared coldly at his back. "Fan Xian, right now it's just you and me. If you have anything to say, you can say it." Fan Xian didn't turn his head. In a quiet voice he replied, "I trust that Sigurjian will be able to hear anything we say. However, I am indeed curious as to how you guessed I was hiding in Lily's room." The northern Qi emperor smiled strangely and didn't explain. On the contrary, he said, "I am also curious as to how you guessed I knew your whereabouts and arranged for someone to kill you." Fan Xian shrugged and pulled his gaze back from the various swords in the pit. Turning to look at the northern Qi emperor, he calmly said, "There is no need to explain this question. Actually, I'm just a bit angry. Why have you become so stupid and childish?" He slowly lowered his eyelids and said, "Have you ever thought about what kind of price the world will pay after you kill me?" The little emperor furrowed his brows. He didn't know if it was because of the unbearable pain in his ankle or because Fan Xian had given him such a low evaluation. Fan Xian walked back from the window and sat on the stool in front of the bed. Calmly, he looked at the little emperor's face. Suddenly he said, "You are no longer young, but I still habitually think of you as a little emperor." Facing the northern Qi emperor, he spoke as if he was talking to a commoner. The attitude and emotions Fan Xian displayed truly shook the northern Qi emperor's heart. This was not a matter of strength. It was a sense of equality rooted in the deepest parts of one's bones and blood. Even if it was Lang Qiao or Yun Jilan, when facing the northern Qi emperor, they would still be incomparably respectful. No one would be like Fan Xian, who saw the dignity of a ruler as nothing. Fan Xian calmly looked at the little emperor's delicate and ordinary face. His thoughts had drifted somewhere. He knew better than anyone else in the world how powerful this little emperor was. A few years ago he, who was still rather immature, had already taken the lead in setting up the Jiangnan area of the Qing kingdom. Regardless of whether it was Fan Xian or the eldest princess who controlled the palace treasury in the future, he would receive some benefits from it. Another example was the death of Xin Zhong, the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guards. This little emperor had cleverly used Shang Shanhu and killed 3 birds with 1 stone. It had to be said that the emperor's heart was like a mirror. However, Fan Xian still could not understand why the emperor would want to kill him. During the Jingdo rebellion in the 7th year of the Qing calendar, the Northern Qi emperor could have used the eldest princess's hand to kill him and then help the great prince ascend to the throne, which would have been of great benefit to Northern Qi. Now 3 years had passed. If he was killed in Dongyi, Northern Qi would not be able to stay out of it. Killing you in Dongyi can at least force Dongyi to be unable to surrender to the Qing kingdom. The little emperor looked at Fan Xian coldly. It was as if she was not afraid of explaining anything in front of him. As for whether or not your death will anger the Qing court, that is not within my consideration. Are you saying that if you don't die, your old emperor will not use military force against the Qi kingdom? The little emperor laughed coldly. Since regardless of whether you live or die, you will not be able to stop the war from erupting, your death can at least have Dongyi side with me. Why wouldn't I do such a good thing? Chapter 633. Of course I didn't explode. I was just making up a chapter about getting drunk on National Day. I didn't think there would be a day when I would make up a chapter. I am becoming more and more diligent. After Fan Xian finished speaking, the Northern Qi Emperor did not think of the legendary blind great master. He did not, because of these words, begin to reflect on the mistakes he had made during these 2 years because of the Qing kingdom's powerful pressure. He only stared at Fan Xian in shock and unconsciously raised his hand to rub his forehead. The anger in his eyes gradually deepened. In the end he could not suppress it. In a low voice he roared, "You dare to hit me!" Fan Xian dared to hit him. Since he dared to kidnap an emperor, he dared to hit him a few times. The little emperor knew this. He just could not accept that Fan Xian would use a blow to hit him on the forehead. This kind of fighting was not a battle to the death. In his eyes, it carried a clear sense of humiliation. Fan Xian paid no attention to his anger. Furrowing his brows he said, "During these years, you and I have worked well together. I think I have brought a great deal of benefit to Northern Qi. But you constantly want me dead. Is that not too much?" The little emperor was still tormented by pain and humiliation. He stared at Fan Xian in disbelief. It was as if he didn't know where such a strange being had jumped out of this world to not have any respect for a worker like the emperor. Fan Xian saw him gritting his teeth like a little lion and was instead amused. Shrugging his shoulders he said, "I am just pointing out the big mistake you have made." He suddenly closed his eyes and thought for a moment. In a quiet voice he said, "Originally the impression you left on me was that you were a shrewd ruler. However, your actions these past 2 years have been too eager for quick success. The world is so beautiful, yet you are so violent. This is not good, not good." The Northern Qi Emperor knew that the situation was not in his favor. He had fallen into Fan Xian's hands. Additionally, the great grandmaster in the sword hut who had never shown himself was leaning toward him. The officials outside the sword hut would probably not be able to enter the sword hut to save him. He could only forcefully suppress the anger in his heart and coldly say, "Why do I need to explain my actions to you? You don't need to explain to anyone, but you need to explain to me." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed and a cold light flashed. "I've given you too many benefits. Even if it's an investment, you have to report it to me, the shareholder, instead of trying to kill me." The negotiation between the two men returned to the original place. The Northern Qi Emperor was silent for a long time. Slowly she said, "I must admit that you have helped me a great deal in the past few years, but what? However, you are, after all, the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child." The little emperor smiled self-mockingly and stood up out of habit, placing her hands behind her back. If this was any other time, this movement would definitely be incomparably elegant and full of emperor's aura. However, today he was dizzy from the shock and his ankle was sprained. How could he stand steadily? With a cry he fell down. Fan Xian reached out and scooped him back onto the bed, looking at him calmly. The little emperor furrowed her brows and said, "You are a person of the Qing kingdom and the Qing emperor's illegitimate child. Regardless of whether or not I believe you have the sincerity to carry out the agreement, Even mother and the officials in court cannot place this illusory hope on a powerful official of the Qing kingdom. He closed his eyes and slowly said, "You are not a person of Qi. You don't know how the ruler and people of Qi have lived these years after Imperial Advisor Ku He's death. The Qing kingdom is ready for battle and could send out troops to invade at any moment. Although I have planned for a long time, in the end the time is still short. It is difficult for the national strength to support a continuous war for many years. Under such circumstances, all past friendships and promises are empty. I must place my hope on my people, even Dongyi. I cannot place my hope on you." Fan Xian listened quietly. He knew this logic was actually very simple. Never mind the Northern Qi Emperor, even Haitang Qin Pingping, and his father did not think he would actually help Northern Qi fight against the Qing kingdom. If he was going to be a traitor, there had to be some benefits. Presently, Fan Xian was a figure in the Qing kingdom who stood above tens of thousands of people. If he sold out the Qing kingdom's interests, did he want the Northern Qi Emperor to give him the throne? He smiled self-mockingly, thinking that no one in the world would believe this, much less the ruler and people of Northern Qi. However, he had never thought about selling out the Qing kingdom's interests to satisfy Northern Qi's request to establish a country. He only wanted to do his best to ease the possibility of a bloody battle to the end in rivers of blood. Just as Li Hongqing had criticized him in the Dingzhou general's manner, this was a childish and absurd idea. Furthermore, from a certain point of view, it was basically impossible. From this, it seemed that it was only natural that Northern Qi wanted to kill Fan Xian, a powerful Qing official, and tie Dongyi to their own chariot. As for the legendary blind great master? It was not that the Northern Qi Emperor did not know of this person. However, his whereabouts were too mysterious. Even if he was truly a great grandmaster standing behind Fan Xian, the threat he posed to Northern Qi was not as real as the powerful Qing Emperor and the powerful Qing army. Seeing that Fan Xian had sunk into thought, the Northern Qi Emperor did not disturb him. Instead, he also closed his eyes and began to think about his situation and what might happen next. One was the ruler of the north and the other was an official of the south. Just like that, they faced each other in the quiet room, each with their own thoughts. They did not know that time flowed by like water. Without them realizing it, the sunset outside the hut was like blood. It shone on the sword pit, making the branches of the ancient broken swords seem to be dyed with the blood of thousands of years. No matter how long they were washed by the sea, wind and rain, they could not be washed clean. Fan Xian stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the large pit in silence. He knew what the countless swords in the pit represented. They represented Sigu Jian's world-dominating sword skills and power. They represented the position of the sword hut in the hearts of the people. They represented the deaths of countless swordsmen and the legends that made one's blood boil. For any kind of reputation or status to remain stable, it actually needed a baptism of swords and blood. In this world, Fan Xian did not have any ability to distinguish or judge how to give those who came after a better future. Did it also need a baptism of blood and fire from the south to the north? Even though he had once discussed it with Yan Bingyun and argued with Li Hongqing, he still did not have the ability to judge whether the separation of the world or the unification of it would be more beneficial. Prolonged pain? Short pain? Thank you. That was a question for historians. It was not a question that creatures born in the present needed to consider. Creatures only needed to consider the present. This was a selfish instinct of living things. Fan Xian was, without question, a selfish person. After he died, even if there was a flood, he only hoped that while he was alive, this world was like the one he liked. There were flowers, trees, grass, insects, birds, people, poems and paintings, wine and gold, no pain, no disaster, and no blood. Now, he deeply saw himself as a Qing person and not the internationalist warrior he had been in the beginning. Sadly, he had grown into a pacifist. He hoped that while he was alive and his children were alive, Spider-Man or Takashi Kato's famous hand gesture could always be raised. The Overwatch Council's nurturing from a young age and many years of jumping between life and death had allowed Fan Xian to grow into a pacifist. This appeared absurd and inconceivable, but it also proved from another angle that when a person was lying on a sickbed waiting for death, the obsession born could affect him for a lifetime or even 2 lifetimes. Only by knowing the terror of death did one know that one should treasure life. "I know the reason for your mistake," Fan Xian slowly said without turning his head. "The Qing kingdom has put too much pressure on you. Although the emperor has not sent out a large number of soldiers these years, each move he has made is all to prepare for the great battle in the future. The emperor walks an upright path. He has already eliminated the existence of great grandmasters, so he disdains using his great grandmaster's strength to disturb the world. He has enough confidence to conquer all of you in a fair and square manner. Fan Xian suddenly felt that the sunset outside was piercing to the eyes. He closed his eyes and said, "Actually, I understand the Emperor very well. The failure of the Northern Expedition 20 years ago was a setback that was difficult for him to accept. For him, monsters like great grandmasters should not exist in this world, even if he himself later became a great grandmaster. He has his own mind and strategy. With these, he can conquer everything. He has a disdain for individual martial power from the depths of his heart. However, he had to first clean out the great grandmasters before he could release this disdain to the extreme." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. "I think that before He died he saw clearly the obsession of my emperor. That is why he slowly placed chess pieces in Xiliang and my court. He wanted to play a final game of chess with the emperor. However, he forgot that, after all, he is already dead. It is impossible for him to know all the details of what happened after his death. Furthermore, Haitang and you, whom he placed his hopes on, have each made an unforgivable mistake." The little emperor had been silently listening to Fan Xian's analysis. Hearing this, she opened her mouth and asked, "What mistake?" "You all underestimate my anger." Fan Xian turned around and looked at the little emperor. Enunciating each word, he said, "I dare to guarantee you that the 2 moves he made before he died were both prepared to land on me. Yet you tried to kill me twice. Regardless of whether you succeeded or not, if he knew of your actions, he would certainly die in his grave in anger." "Land on you?" The little emperor's pupils constricted slightly. She thought back to great Uncle He's instructions before his death. Her expression gradually became serious. She still did not understand why she had placed the hope of Northern Qi's survival on Fan Xian. Was he not the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child? Was Fan Xian really a great saint? No, the last saint in the world had died a long time ago in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. Fan Xian was only a common person. Fan Xian laughed coldly. Of course, He's calculations were very good. He had truly grasped my heart. Even in death, he could not guess whether or not I would continue down the path he imagined. The matter referred to in these words was too secretive. The Northern Qi Emperor could not hear it clearly. "I will think of a way to control all of this. If I cannot control it, I can easily leave." Fan Xian walked out of the dusk outside the window. He grew closer and closer to the little emperor's body. In a slightly heavy voice, he said, "It would be best if you could listen to me more." "Why should I listen to you?" For some reason, the little emperor suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Because you have made too many mistakes. Although the Northern Qi court has been managed well by you these few years, and I had thought that another extraordinary Wu Zhou had appeared in history, in the end, I have found that women are still too easily angered and soft-hearted. They cannot hold up much." After these words were said, the little emperor's expression changed dramatically, but he immediately returned to his usual appearance. Narrowing his eyes, he said, "Sir Fan Jr.'s words are becoming more and more mysterious. Earlier you wanted to kill me. If you hadn't considered Sea Lily's life and had the eunuchs trick her out of the room, and had instead used Lang Qiao to directly attack, perhaps I would already be dead." Fan Xian stood in front of him and lifted his chin with a calm expression. The soft-heartedness of women was completely displayed at that moment. "You have disappointed me so much. How could I continue to do business with you?" The little emperor's eyes narrowed further and further until they became 2 crescent moons. It was as if he wanted to use the slits of his eyelids to look at Fan Xian even more. Only then could he calm the boundless fear and struggle in his heart. This was a secret he and the Northern Qi Empress Dowager had stubbornly kept for 20 years. For this secret, countless people had died in the Northern Qi court and paid a great price. Yet, at this moment, it had been lightly spoken of by a Qing person. "My goal today is to enter the sword hut to see Sigujian, but I have another goal. I want to have a private conversation with you, Your Majesty." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "I want to tell you that if you still want to be the Emperor of Northern Qi from now on, don't try to secretly attack me. On the contrary, you have to cooperate with me. Do you understand?" The little emperor pulled up the corners of his lips and laughed loudly. "Fan Xian, you want to threaten me? You can kill me with one stroke of the knife and see if I, the descendant of the Zhan family, will frown. Your determination is truly admirable." Fan Xian looked at him with a smile in his eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "Naturally, I cannot kill her. I just want to know if Shang Shanhu, Lang Qiao, and a group of important Northern Qi officials suddenly discovered that the emperor they are loyal to is actually a woman, what kind of reaction would they have? The Northern Qi Zhan family only has you one woman. Is there still a need for it to exist? The little emperor stared fixedly at Fan Xian. At this moment he finally understood why Si Lily had said earlier that Fan Xian would not be afraid of him at all. Instead, it was he who should be afraid of him. It was because Fan Xian held his fate, the absolute fate. The little emperor's voice was raspy. He smiled coldly and said, "The immortal poet of a generation does indeed speak with an air of stupidity." Chapter 634. Without question, this is the most difficult chapter I've written since the end of the Qing dynasty. I wrote it for a full 5 hours. Tomorrow's chapter is also very difficult. I just hope everyone is satisfied. Pleasure Before the Palace is the name of the 6th volume. Originally, I had planned to put this scene in the 1st volume. Later, I confirmed that it should be put in this volume. Tomorrow's chapter has the words, Emperor of the Qin. Her long hair fell gently from her ears to her shoulders. The warmth of this moment made the Northern Qi Emperor perplexed. It was as if the darkness in the deepest depths of her heart had dispersed with Fan Xian's action of undoing her hair. It would no longer become a heavy burden pressing down on the tip of her heart and making it difficult for her to breathe. In that moment she had already given up and accepted her fate. She even faintly liked that her long hair could float down so softly. Across from her was Fan Xian, the Fan Xian she had once loved incomparably and hated incomparably. The Fan Xian who had once fearlessly displayed her gentle and beautiful side when she was intoxicated by him. The little emperor had no time to think. Perhaps she had already thought that if there was someone in this world who knew she was a girl, Fan Xian would be the best choice. She had long revealed everything to him. However, at the time he had been unconscious and didn't know. The little emperor's faint beauty and sorrow, a rare glimmer of a girl's aura, and the only return of a woman in her life. It was all on Fan Xian's body. She accepted her fate. She even had to force herself to grit her teeth and suppress the helpless joy in her heart. With a tearing sound, the front of the little emperor's robe was torn open by Fan Xian's coffin-breaking hand with unusual regularity, revealing her body that had never been seen before. She was dumbstruck. Her gaze began to scatter. She was shocked speechless by this powerful attack and danger. She could only stare dazedly into Fan Xian's eyes. Her entire body was stiff and difficult to move. Her hands were tightly clenched in anger and trembled endlessly, causing the wooden bed beneath her to creak. The little emperor did not cover her chest. She allowed the light of spring to gradually seep through the white cloth and fill the room. She stared angrily and hatefully at Fan Xian. She found that Fan Xian's gaze was fixed on her chest. His eyes revealed an aura that she hated. Then she heard Fan Xian's words about her chest developing. An awkward and angry blush rose from the corner of the little emperor's eyes and gradually spread, covering her cheeks, ears, and neck. In the end, even the snow-white skin on her chest above the white cloth began to glow with a faint and alluring red. Dusk gathered outside the window, but it was far less eye-piercing than the bright red of the little emperor's body. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. His right hand seemed to not listen to his orders as it reached under the little emperor's chin and flicked. After removing the disguise on the little emperor's throat and removing the fake Adam's apple, even though her chest was still covered by the white cloth, the feeling of her entire person softened, gradually developing in the direction of a little girl. Fan Xian carefully studied her brows, her eyes, and gradually moved closer to her. It was as if he was admiring a unique treasure. He remained silent the entire time. He was indeed very surprised. How could a woman hide from the world for 20 years? She had been emperor in Northern Qi for 20 years, but no one had been able to discover a single problem. His eyebrows had been trimmed since he was young, and they gradually grew thicker. There seemed to be some medicine at the corners of his eyes, which made the emotions in his eyes appear more stable. As for his gaze and manner, it was presumably the training the Northern Qi Empress Dowager had given the little emperor since she was young. Fan Xian was only in the spirit of research. He was shocked by one of the greatest secrets in the world, which was why he moved closer and closer. He didn't notice that although the little emperor stood angrily and rigidly by the bed, the anger in her eyes grew fainter and fainter into hatred and coldness. The Northern Qi Emperor was a woman. Although this was something Fan Xian had guessed 3 years ago, if the two of them were not alone in the quiet room, he would never be able to confirm or use this in his entire life. Putting aside how he was going to use the Northern Qi Empress Dowager and her son's greatest weakness in the future, just confirming this shocking secret was enough to make Fan Xian excited. Right at this moment, a fist that was definitely not as big as an earthenware bowl appeared in front of Fan Xian's eyes. The skin on the fist was smooth and tender. It was even possible to see a faint green vein. This also proved that the fist was very powerful, had accumulated power for a long time, and was very fast. With a muffled slap, 2 streams of fresh blood flowed out of Fan Xian's nostrils. He angrily covered his nose and glared viciously at the little emperor who still had her fist extended. He thought to himself that it wasn't because of this flat-chested woman that his nose was bleeding, so it wasn't too embarrassing. With his 9th level strength, he had actually been hit in the nose by a female emperor who had only learned a few tricks from Lang Tiao. This was actually embarrassing enough. If he had not been too engrossed, too shocked, and had too much desire to explore the little emperor's face, brows, eyes, and chest, he would not have been hit by this punch. The little emperor slowly pulled back her fist and smiled coldly. In my life, I have never been so lightly humiliated by anyone. Anyone who looks down on me will pay the price. These words were said with an imposing aura. Paired with the little emperor's natural monarch face and the faint mockery at the corner of her lips, it was powerful without anger. It appeared to have some power. At this moment, the front of the little emperor's robe was completely torn. The strips of cloth hung weakly from the bright yellow sash. She was as wretched as one could imagine, yet she still made such an appearance. It was truly comical. Fan Xian did not laugh. After wiping away the blood from his nose, he calmly said, "I don't care about this punch, but I don't want it to happen again in the future. Don't forget you are a woman. You're a woman." These words smashed viciously into the little emperor's heart, smashing her heart into chaos. Her liver and intestines were cut into pieces, and her heart trembled with fear. A wave of sadness, anger, and despair filled her heart. Even the messy black hair floating around her lips felt her emotions. It pressed into her lips and let her bite it viciously. Fan Xian was stunned by this hopeless expression. He was not a soft-hearted person. However, he had never thought that the little Northern Qi Emperor would one day reveal such a pitiful appearance. The Northern Qi court and various major events these years had already proven this female emperor's abilities. Under the powerful pressure of the Qin kingdom's ruler and officials, she was still able to maintain Northern Qi's stability. Just based on this, Fan Xian had to give her high marks for her ability to govern. 20 years of pretending and living as an emperor had, without question, twisted the little emperor's mentality somewhat. However, this kind of distortion was still within a controllable range. On the contrary, because she had to be on guard at all times against the leaking of secrets, she became even more cautious and prudent. She had a steadiness and maturity that others of her age could not have. Even when she was being restrained by Fan Xian, she still did not panic. When Fan Xian mercilessly reminded her that her secret could become known to the world tomorrow, she finally could not bear it anymore. Her hard outer shell shattered into countless pieces like a sea snail after being crushed by a large rock. The little emperor's gaze was very hateful and angry, but there was a strange calm inside. It was a calm like a deathly stillness. After the calmness, a crazed expression gradually appeared. Fan Xian had seen this kind of expression before. In the instant before the eldest princess Li Yunrui died, his heart grew nervous. He slowly lowered his hands, ready to act at any moment. The little emperor's expression was slightly wooden. She opened her lips and allowed her black hair to slide down. In an icy voice she said, "I am not a person who will be threatened." She thought she could guess what Fan Xian would do after knowing her secret. With such a large secret in his hands, given the Overwatch Council's power, he could easily shake the foundations of the Northern Qi royal family's rule. The entire North would sink into chaos because of this news. "You cannot use me. If you expose this matter, I will have no value to you. If you hide this matter, how could I allow you to use me?" The little emperor looked at Fan Xian hatefully. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then slowly lowered his head and said, "I don't ask for much. I just want you to be more obedient." The corners of his lips twitched up in self-mockery. "After all, you are a woman. No matter how powerful you are, at certain critical junctures, you will never be able to stand up to us stinky men. It is impossible to rely on you to accomplish great things." The little emperor's eyes narrowed. "It looks like you have long thought about what will happen next, but why would I listen to you?" After these words were said, determination flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Viciousness surged. She took out a small dagger from somewhere in her sleeve and viciously stabbed it toward her chest. After entering the sword hut, Fan Xian felt safe. He did not take the little emperor seriously, so he did not search the little emperor's body. After all, he knew she was a woman and didn't want to offend her too much. He had no idea that the little emperor still had the last dagger she could use to kill herself. Had this dagger been given to her by the Northern Qi Empress Dowager when she was very young? For some reason, a faint glimmer of sympathy suddenly surged in Fan Xian's heart. He sympathized with the female emperor in front of him. She lived in constant fear that her gender would be discovered and that she could not live like other girls. How could there be any joy in such a life? He swept closer and flicked the tip of his finger, flicking the little emperor's pulse. With a clang, the little dagger fell to the bottom of the bed. A viciousness flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Her left hand silently moved the crossbow in her sleeve. Fan Xian's strange cry rang out in the room. He forcefully twisted his body beside the bed. His body rolled like a gray dragon. In an extremely dangerous situation, he avoided the 3 crossbow bolts. His clothes had already been slightly torn by the 3 poison bolts. Fortunately, he was still wearing the Overwatch Council's uniform underneath. Otherwise, this attack alone would have injured him. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt and threw the little emperor onto the bed. Pressing down on her shoulders with both hands, he angrily threw a punch, landing squarely on the little emperor's cheek. His anger was because he had just felt some sympathy for this female emperor and had almost been secretly injured by her. Only now did he understand that she was, after all, an emperor, a third kind of creature outside of men and women. When faced with the greatest predicament of her life, she would not hesitate to pay any price, even her own life, to kill him. Blood flowed from the corners of the little emperor's lips, but she did not faint. She lay proudly and resentfully on the bed. Looking at Fan Xian straddling her, she said, "If you have the guts, kill me." Of course, Fan Xian would not kill her. After grasping her secret, as long as he could truly subdue her heart, this ruler of a country would become, after Uncle Wu Zhu, his third magical treasure in this world. How could he subdue a stubborn, intelligent emperor who had been a man for 20 years and acted with a masculine decisiveness? The shortest path through a woman's heart was her body. Fan Xian understood this principle. He rode on the little emperor's body and felt the elasticity unique to a woman under him that could not be faked. He knew how ambiguous this position was and how full of spring. After all, he was not a rapist. Furthermore, he did not think that he would be able to achieve his goal after raping the Northern Qi Emperor. Given his judgment of the little emperor, if he let the little emperor go after this, perhaps she would only take hot water to wash her lower body and treat it as if she had been bitten by a dog. She would never see his face again and cut off all of his follow-up methods. The little emperor struggled under Fan Xian's body. Having been raised as a boy, her strength was far more powerful than her martial cultivation. Fan Xian was momentarily distracted and almost flipped over by her. Fan Xian looked at the blood at the corners of her lips and her resentful gaze. A wave of annoyance and anger welled up in his heart. Lowering his voice, he roared angrily, "You are such a troublemaker. You want to kill me, that's why I'm dealing with you." "Dealing with me?" The little emperor suddenly stopped struggling. A fist smashed toward Fan Xian's beautiful and loathsome face. She said angrily, "Do you still dare to rape me?" Fan Xian dodged this sinister punch and finally found it difficult to suppress his anger. Feeling wronged, he said angrily, "It was you who raped me back then. How dare you say I was going to rape you?" The little emperor's expression changed. Perhaps she was thinking of the scene that happened in the rundown temple outside Shangjing that summer. Her entire strength weakened. What kind of person was she to treat the emperor as a skilled worker? She knew that she could not lower her head to Fan Xian at this moment. Otherwise, she would be oppressed by him for the rest of her life. Thus, she angrily lowered her head and slammed it toward Fan Xian's chin, intending to turn over and become the master. After the little emperor heard the words, "that summer," it was as if she had gone crazy. She attacked Fan Xian in a frenzy. Biting, twisting, and hammering. No one knew where such a crazy aura and boundless power came from in this little body. Fan Xian did not want to kill her. For a moment he was beaten into a wretched state. A few red marks appeared on his arm from her bite through his clothes. He was also bitten into a rage. He slapped toward her body with one palm as if he was hitting Fan Xia's butt. Perhaps the spectators watching the farce in the sword hut would ask, why didn't Sir Fan Jr. knock the little emperor unconscious? The reason was simple. Unconscious people always wanted to wake up. If he didn't make the little emperor yield, Fan Xian would have taken all these risks for nothing. There was another reason he could not say it aloud. In reality, fighting with a female emperor was like fighting with children. Their ears rubbed against each other, their clothes tangled, and their limbs intertwined. It felt like the water in West Lake rippling and gradually flowing into the boat, the bed, and the hearts of the people on it. The two of them carried out a close contest on the bed. It was what was known as judo. Those who had seen judo knew that one of the necessary moves was to pull at clothes. However, even the sturdiest clothes would one day be pulled apart. In the end, the little emperor's white cloth made of an unknown material finally broke. It made the second tearing sound in the dark room. Fan Xian was sitting on her body. His eyes were filled with a boundless expanse of snow. His gaze was unfocused. He thought to himself that she was not only a woman but also a great woman. There were red plum blossoms on the snow. The man and woman playing in the snow were both tired. The little emperor sat on Fan Xian's body with disheveled clothing and pressed down on his hands. She completely did not notice that half of her chest was exposed. It was all in Fan Xian's eyes. The current situation was more like the little emperor raping Fan Xian. The long black hair at the corner of the little emperor's forehead was wet with sweat and stuck together. Paired with her straight brows, it gave her a particularly elegant feeling. Everyone in the world respected her as an emperor and never dared to look directly at her. Even if they did, it was impossible to see any other feeling. However, in Fan Xian's heart, she was a proper woman. Looking at this scene, he felt a sense of excitement he had never felt before. A woman with weakness in her strength, a woman with the identity of an emperor, a woman who would never be satisfied with being ridden on by someone else, clung tightly to him and carried out the most intimate contact. The little emperor rode on Fan Xian's body and didn't feel that Fan Xian had suddenly sunk into silence. She was almost out of strength. She didn't know what her future or Northern Qi's future was. Hopelessness filled her heart. The events of 20 years had made her incomparably tired. She wanted to lie down, but her identity as the Northern Qi Emperor made it impossible for her to lie down and rest. She suddenly felt that she was very pitiful and blinked her eyes helplessly. Following this blink, a few drops of sweat slid down her long black hair and landed on Fan Xian's chin. Like a drop of oil entering a fire, it lit the fire in Fan Xian's heart. Is this the position in the temple? Fan Xian's voice was raspy as he looked at the face and the slightly moving snowy mound close to him. The little emperor held his hands and lowered her head weakly. Boundless sorrow, dissatisfaction, and anger rose in her heart. She suddenly raised her head and stared fiercely into Fan Xian's eyes. Perhaps she was thinking of the scene in the temple or had made up her mind to decide something in the middle of her life as an emperor, even if it was a crazy and absurd thing. Chapter 635. Good, I finally wrote 6,666 words yesterday. What's funny is that I couldn't do it the day before yesterday when I tried to do it. Yesterday I wrote carelessly and wrote this many words. The title of today's chapter is Every Emperor, Every Minister. Of course it's the Chao of day and night, not the Chao of dynasty. I said yesterday that today's chapter was difficult to write. After I finished it and looked back, I found that it was indeed difficult to write. A paragraph of 4,000 words took up 40,000 words of my energy. In this life I have never written such words. To be able to write at this level, I admire myself very much. It is not only related to eroticism, but also the revealing of my hidden personality. I didn't change Lu Lang to Fan Lang because it was a homophonic sound and it was fun to play around with it. As soon as their lips touched, the heavenly thunder and earthly fire moved and the wind and rain raged. The two of them were like young beasts on the grassland as they bit each other. There was not much gentleness and charm, only a hint of excitement mixed with hatred. The blood between their lips rippled on the tips of their tongues. It was salty, wet and salty. This was not intimacy or seduction. It was purely a battle between a man and a woman. The use of lips and tongues in battle often walked the path of Su Qin or Zhang Yi. No one had thought that even a kiss could be kissed to the point of blood. A tongue that was like an orchid could also be so stubborn, bouncing, struggling, and forcefully suppressed. In a small space, it transformed into endless symbolic meaning. Either the east wind overpowered the west wind or the west wind overpowered the east wind. The soft fragrance between the lips and teeth viciously and erotically displayed the process of battle. It made one's tongue ache and salivate, giving birth to the gradually accumulating desire of spring. Liao had said that when a man saw a woman, other than one place that was hard, the rest of the place would go soft. Although Fan Xian was a person with a firm will, under such erotic attacks, he was naturally ridden by the little emperor. He was unwilling and tried to resist. Both of his hands hit the other's buttocks forcefully. The tender place that was usually hidden under the dragon robe made people want to ask him, Was he hitting someone or was he flirting with them? The twilight outside the quiet room was getting darker and darker, but the temperature inside was getting higher and higher. The air seemed to be filled with the dual aura of battle and intimacy. The aura was mixed together with the faint smell of sweat. From time to time, muffled groans could be heard, making one's heart sway. Someone bit someone's tongue, causing a cry of pain. Someone crushed someone's moon, causing a soft hum. Someone scattered someone's long hair, causing it to scatter on their snow-white skin. Someone hugged someone's waist, causing angry curses and even more intense rubbing to occur. A cut appeared at the corner of Fan Xian's lips. He gazed at the little emperor on top of him, at her fragrant shoulders and jade chest, as well as the stubborn and unyielding gaze in her eyes. With a muffled grunt, he flipped over and pushed her down onto the bed. Pressing down on top of her, he stared fiercely at her. The little emperor did not show any weakness. She stared back viciously and bit down on Fan Xian's shoulder again. She threw out a punch. Her waist exerted strength, wanting to spring up and take back control of the initiative. Fan Xian's expression finally changed. The large wooden bed in the sword hut creaked. He pressed down heavily on the little emperor's shoulders and gazed at her, panting endlessly. He didn't say anything. He only looked into her eyes, wanting to see something more real in them and not something as inexplicable as it was now. Unfortunately, he saw many things in the little emperor's eyes, such as hatred, hidden bitterness, hopelessness, relief, strong desire, and a faint sense of confusion. However, he did not see a glimmer of calculation or anything else. The battle between men and women was often like this. When one discovered that the other had already sunk in first, they would often follow and jump in. Feeling the endlessly struggling and tender body beneath him, the rising and falling curves, the two lumps of softness against his chest, the slightly cool skin covered in beads of sweat, and particularly the shape and bounciness he could feel with his body pressed tightly against each other, the calmness in Fan Xian's eyes turned into a wisp of smoke after a moment. Following the little emperor's laborious and quiet hum by his ear, he flew up into the sky and could no longer control anything. His hand slid down from her shoulder and gently held it. Her upper body rose. Her lips slid down from his ear to his shoulder and bit down viciously. He was in pain, so he used more force, causing the thing in his hand to change shape. She was in pain, uncomfortable and strange, so she trembled. Unconsciously, she hugged his body and straightened her upper body with difficulty. Pressing against him, she felt his heartbeat and her own disappointing heartbeat, as well as that strange and complicated feeling of stimulation. In the quiet room there were no other sounds. There were only heartbeats, panting, clothes rubbing against each other, and the occasional gust of wind from a fist and two cries of pain. The movements grew louder and louder. The wooden bed was almost unable to endure such torture. The creaking grew clearer as if it was going to fall apart at any moment. It was confused as to what the man and woman above were doing. If they wanted to do it, then do it well. Life was only a short 70 years. Why fight for this moment? However, what the man and woman were fighting for was this moment. They hurt each other, loved each other, and played with each other. They distanced themselves and then pulled closer. Feeling the other's burning body temperature, they suddenly left with palpitations, but they were also reluctant. Sweat dripped onto the thin blanket and floated faintly on the two of them. It seemed to have been evaporated by the extremely hot atmosphere in the room and turned into a thin mist, concealing the man and woman who were entangled together inside. The silent battle had reached its most critical moment. The clothes were like snow and had long melted in this scene of three springs. The two people who had returned to the primitive era panted and looked at each other in a daze. They stuck together. In the end, the little emperor still flipped over and became the master. She sat on Fan Xian's abdomen. Her hands pressed against Fan Xian's well-proportioned and hard chest. Her black hair fell down and half covered the snowy mound in front of her chest. Her breathing was uneven. "I want to be on top." There was a patch of mud between the two of them. Sweat followed the black hair and dripped onto Fan Xian's chest and the little emperor's hands. Fan Xian looked at the woman on top of him and felt the strange movement below. His heart beat violently, but he forcefully maintained his state of mind. In a raspy voice he asked, "I want to know your name." The little emperor was not a normal woman. She was used to being a man and not a delicate woman. Even at such a time full of spring, she still wanted to be on top. As an emperor, she could only ever ride others and not be ridden. She had to be on top. Fan Xian did not care about this. He was a modern person. He knew action and reaction. He knew what the theory of relativity was. Being ridden and riding were all the same. He only had to know the other person's name before that moment happened. In order to become one with him, it had to be a woman with a name, his woman, and not just a female emperor. Emperor was just a title, but a name represented much more. The Northern Qi Emperor's upper body was naked. The clothes on her lower body were piled up. They barely covered her waist and buttocks, but they could not hide the heat and mud inside. There was no longer the despair and resentment from before in her eyes. There was only competitiveness and a powerful curiosity toward unfamiliar things, as well as the habitual order of an emperor. The secret room was silent. No one knew how long the two of them had tormented each other, hurt each other, or been intimate. This was the first time they had spoken. After these 2 sentences, the atmosphere in the room seemed to have changed subtly, particularly after hearing Fan Xian ask for her name. The little emperor allowed her black waterfall-like hair to sweep across his handsome face. Stretching out her fingertips, she slid them confusedly across his picturesque brows and eyes. In a raspy voice she said, "You can call me Daodu right now." Jean Daodu? Fan Xian only had time to ask in his heart before he sucked in a cold breath. She gently swayed her waist and buttocks and slowly sat down on his abdomen. As she sat down, the tips of her brows furrowed together as if she was in great pain. The mountain path was narrow. Although it was covered in mud, it made the journey even more difficult. If one wanted to cross the Yellow River, one had to climb the snow-covered mountains of Taihang. Fan Xian's chest rose and fell. His hands unconsciously slid down her alluring waist and gently placed them on the 2 lumps of softness in the depths of her clothes. He gently pinched them. Idle, fishing in the green stream, suddenly riding a boat to dream of the sun. The path is difficult and the paths are many. Where is peace now? She gently bit her lower lip, feeling a slight pain. However, she refused to let go for a moment of the hands pressing down on Fan Xian's shoulders. She moved her body slowly, forcefully, and even somewhat domineeringly. The burning pain made her expression appear particularly serious. She was like a ruler conquering all the difficulties and obstacles in the world. Seeing this scene, Fan Xian's expression changed. He was even slightly confused. His hands unconsciously began to move. After an indeterminable amount of time, the ice and snow gradually melted. The wind broke through the waves and gradually reached the vast ocean. The 2 of them slowly came together and held each other tightly. They trembled because of the pain, trembled because of intoxication, and trembled because of the shyness that had finally floated to the top of the woman's heart. Time gradually passed and dusk gradually disappeared. The man and woman on the bed were either on top or below. Although they were silent and stubborn, alluring and twisted, no one was willing to admit defeat. No one was willing to lower their heads. A new emperor brought a new group of officials. On the large bed, the relationship between the ruler and his officials had long fallen into chaos. The fragrant path was once swept by a drunken guest. The door was opened for you for the second time. The peach blossoms were all gone, and where did they go? When this battle finally ended, it was Fan Xian who successfully returned to the top. He didn't know how many times he had fought with this stubborn woman. Finally, he successfully took advantage of the moment when her entire body was limp to take back control. This battle was crazy and rough. Fan Xian lay on top of her, panting. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at the wound on his shoulder. He found that the woman beneath him had bitten him until his flesh was a bloody mess. He couldn't help a wave of fear. Lowering his head to look, he saw that the beautiful person in his arms no longer had the usual lofty appearance of an emperor. Her cheeks were rosy and her gaze was blurry. Her thin lips were slightly open, and her breath smelled like orchids. She was very tired. How was she different from a normal woman? The only thing that was a bit blinding was the green mark on her snow-white chest. Fan Xian's heart thumped. He wondered how he could have been so rough earlier. After a man had his desires fulfilled and exploded, he would change from an animal to a hypocritical saint. He would be willing to light a cigarette and read a newspaper, but he would certainly immediately break away from the woman in his arms. Fan Xian was no exception. He gently held the little emperor's naked body and did not leave. Instead, he watched her quietly, thinking about something. This scene had actually happened 4 years ago. However, at that time, Fan Xian was completely unconscious and didn't know what had happened. What he felt now was very real. It involuntarily gave rise to an absurd feeling in his heart. This long-haired woman was the emperor of Northern Qi, the ruler of a country. Yet, at this moment she was curled up in his arms like a little rabbit. The little emperor was tired. Her eyes were closed. Her not long eyelashes blinked slightly. She probably hadn't fallen asleep, but she held Fan Xian's waist and refused to let go. The corners of her lips twitched slightly as she sighed in satisfaction. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian should be proud. For some reason he suddenly felt a chill. He remembered a movie he had seen in his last life. It was the movie that everyone loved, When Sally Met Harry. In the end, Megan cried and had a runny nose as she slept with Billy Crystal, her best friend of more than 10 years. In the end, she pouted her lips and sighed in satisfaction. She was like a pregnant female praying mantis, preparing to enjoy the feast of the male praying mantis later. The story of Fan Xian and the little emperor going to bed today was actually just as strange and expected. She had also cried in a moment earlier. Thus Fan Xian felt afraid. He was afraid that he would become a male praying mantis. It was at this moment that the little emperor opened her eyes and woke up. She did not pick up the thin blanket to cover her naked body. She brazenly exposed herself in front of Fan Xian. It was as if this was still her country and Fan Xian was her official. She was silent for a moment. Suddenly she glanced at Fan Xian with complicated emotions. Smiling slightly she said, "I am your woman." Fan Xian didn't know what he should say right now. Hearing these words he still felt incomparably awkward. "I want to be on top. I am your woman." It was truly a headache-inducing word. The little emperor sat up and very naturally combed her hair in front of Fan Xian. Her eyes looked at the night outside the window. Enunciating each word she said, "I can promise you that in this life, there will not be another man. Of course, I will not ask you not to find other women. However, you should understand that since I have become your woman, my country is also your country. You have to be careful. That you're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.